Sehr verehrte Damen und Herren, Ladies and Gentlemen, es ist mir eine große Ehre, in meiner Funktion und Rolle als Direktor der Hochschule für Musik und der Musikakademie Basel, Stefan Schmidt ist mein Name, Sie heute herzlich begrüßen zu dürfen. I'm very happy to be able to welcome you to the symposium in my role as director of the University of Music and the Musikakademie Basel. It's an honor for me to greet you here with a few words. My role as director is for the whole institution and the campus to help that things are possible. And for example, also with the Maya Sacher Stiftung, who helps to finance the symposium, to give you and to give the Institute of the Schola Cantorum the space and the time to live their expertise to the highest expectations. Unfortunately, I cannot live my role that I prefer the most, to be a student and listener, today and the following days, because I have other things also to look for, but I would be wishing and hoping that in the future maybe I can also participate as you participate. I will not be able to contribute. I'm not an expertise in your music specialty, but I would like to participate as listener and as student or pupil, because there's always at every symposium happening so many interesting events and informations, and I know the big history of all the symposiums, so I wish you the very best, inspiring moments, lots of interesting informations, and a lot of social exchange as well. My best wishes.
Vielen Dank, Stefan Schmidt. Ich darf Sie im Namen der Leitung der Schola Cantorum Basiliensis herzlich zu diesem Symposium Carmina Burana vom Codex zum Klang begrüßen. Mein Name ist Martin Kirnbauer und ich habe zurzeit den Vorsitz der Leitung. Dieser erste Satz war eine Referenz vor den bilingualen Liedern der Carmina Burana und dem Codex Buranus, und now I will switch to English. The Schola is probably the only music school in the world that can organize and hold such a symposium on the Carmina Burana, as well as the underlying research project financed by the Swiss National Science Foundation, Carmina Burana Online. Only here is a large and vibrant medieval department, which also was at the beginning of the new Schola reorganized by Wolf Alt in 1970, 55 years ago from today. With a prospective plans for a new diploma in medieval and Renaissance music, which is now reality, and the integration of the Studio der frühen Musik with Thomas Binkley 3 years later in 1973. Earlier excursions into the music of the Middle Ages were mainly guided by Ina Lohr and her completely different interests in music. In the past, however, the scholars' annual symposia have rarely been devoted exclusively to the music world of the Middle Ages. Particularly noteworthy are the first symposia at the Schola, and these are documented in the Basler Jahrbücher für historische Musikpraxis, which are all now online and open access, and you can find them if you go on the link Forschung Schola Cantorum Basiliensis, our Forschungsportal, you will find them all. And here is documented the very first symposium of the Schola in 1977 was zur Aufführungspraxis des mittelalterlichen Liedes. A few years later, 1980, aspects of the interpretation of medieval music. Or 3 years later, 1983, improvisation in medieval and Renaissance music. And last but not least, medieval musical instruments in 1984. However, topics relating to medieval music and musical practice were repeatedly present in our other symposia with broader questions, as, for example, in the volume Moved by Sound, Emotions in Early Music. This is published in relation to a symposium 3 years ago. 2 years? 3 years ago, I think, and it will be come out in a few days, hopefully before Friday, so you can have it, but you will find it open access online in any case. And I may cautiously announce a symposium on Guillaume de Machaut in 2027, so to speak, in the shadow of Beethoven, the other great anniversary figure in this year. The team of the SNF project, Carmina Burana Online, this is namely Laura Albiero, Ugo Bindini, Mathieu Romanin, and Christelle Cazaux, who organized most of this event here. They worked for many years, not many years, 2 years. They started years ago, I would say 1 year you spent on organizing this symposium in discussion with the advisory board, scientific advisory board of the Schola, project partners, and various colleagues. So we are now looking forward for the coming days when all these ideas and discussions will be put into practice. Before I hand over to Christelle for some introductory words and organizational instructions, I would like to express my sincere thanks to different people. First of all, already named the Meyer-Sacher Foundation, who financed not only this symposium, but many research activities which otherwise wouldn't be possible. Then, of course, this was National Science Foundation, who is financing the important project Carmina Burana Online. Then all colleagues at the Schola who have been putting their heart and soul into this project for the last years, together with the students. This is Marc Levon, Katarina Liveljanic, and Baptiste Romain. Then the research department, there are many people in the research department who helped also a little bit. Kelly Landerkin, we will hear afterwards in the afternoon. Johannes Menke, Martina Papiro, Agnese Pavanello, Uri Smilanski, who will be hopefully with us. Perfect. You will hear in a moment why I'm so relieved to see him here. And of course, Christelle. Then I would like to thank Claudia Scherli, who is responsible for the organizational details. Unfortunately, she is ill, get well soon if she is listening, and now Birgit Leber took over and Katrin Menzel, who is ill as well, did other things. Then there is Esther Müller and Andi Westermann here behind me, who are responsible for sound, video, and streaming. And last but not least, I would like to thank the speakers coming to Basel and presenting their interesting papers. And the very last thank are to Ian Harrison, who played with his students, the Alta Capella. They gave us an insight into what's happening now with this music from the Carmina in a, let's say, a modern interpretation. It's perhaps not exactly fitting what is happening in the research on this codex, but we will have plenty possibilities to discuss this. And my sincere thanks to Emma, Marianne, Yuniyu, Sugang, Wiley, Laura, and Ian. So, and now I stop talking and hand over to Christelle.
Hallo, hallo? Ja. Danke. Danke, Stefan, er ist schon weg. Und danke, Martin, für diese Einführungsworte. Ich werde jetzt auf Englisch wechseln. And yes, the Codex Buranus is famous for preserving the Carmina Burana. And it needs little introduction, actually. For most people, the name evokes Carl Orff's scenic cantata, premiered in Frankfurt in 1937. Orff never saw the Codex Buranus. Assisted in selecting the text for his cantata by the Bamberg librarian and Latinist Michael Hofmann, he relied on Johann Andreas Schmeller's 1847 edition, the very first one. Schmeller, a philologist and Germanist, indeed one of the founding figures of Germanistic, was the one who named the text of the Codex Buranus Carmina Burana. And the name has remained ever since. Even though 180 years later, it seems a bit less appropriate. Carmen refers rather to Latin metrical poems in the Middle Ages, whereas the kind of versification found in about 230 of the 270 items in the Codex Buranus is rhythmic, based on rhyme, syllable count, and stress pattern. Burana refers to Benedict Beuren, the place where the manuscript was discovered in 1803. But it was certainly not produced in that Bavarian Benedictine abbey. Rhythmic poetry was supposed to be sung. Always? All of it? Musicologists tend to think so, perhaps all the more readily because they have been accustomed to studying in particular those roughly 750 Latin rhythmi that have been transmitted with a melody in one of the sources known to date. Medieval scribes copied text far more often than music. Writing music required specialized skills, as well as knowledge of the melodies, or at least models ready to be copied, exemplar. Entire repertoires could circulate locally and more widely for long periods before being committed to writing, at least in collections specifically dedicated to them. But new pieces or lesser-known ones could also be the first to be written down in the additions or marginalia of all sorts of manuscripts. Among the earliest surviving musical notations, we often find not primarily chant melodies, for example, but newer genres such as prosulas and sequences, which had to be recorded in order to support mnemonic effort. This phenomenon was not limited to liturgy, not to the early Middle Ages. troubadour and trouvère lyrics circulated mainly orally until they were recorded in chansonniers. And so probably did the Latin rhythmy and the German songs that flourished from the 12th century onwards. We find them mainly in later manuscripts from the 13th century onwards, as far as we can tell from the surviving ones. The Codex Buranus is one of them, but its scale, structure, layout, and notation set it apart from all other major collections, such as the Notre Dame manuscripts or various non-Parisian sources, with quotation marks, which have long concentrated the efforts of musicologists. By contrast, the Codex Buranus has traditionally attracted literary scholars, much more than musicologists. As a thematically organized anthology, it shapes a discourse on the world, on the church, on love, entertainment, men and women, clerics and knights, classical heroes and heroines, and even poetic creation. For musicologists seeking melodies, however, the Codex Buranus can be frustrating at first sight. It's not transcribable neumes written on only about 50 text units, and the lack of parallel notated witnesses for half of the whole collection make musical analysis and modern reconstruction particularly challenging. Despite these difficulties, the music of the medieval Carmina Burana has also attracted wide attention from musicians, especially within the broader movement of the early music revival. At some point, however, musicologists had to engage more deeply with the manuscript to scrutinize the notated pieces, not only to look for parallel sources or possible contrafacta, but also to observe the internal logic of the whole and the place that music occupies within it, rather than studying individual pieces removed from their context, analyzed separately or in small clusters by author, by formal structure, or according to criteria that are often external to the source raison d'être. That's what we are trying to do within the Carmina Burana Online project, carried out together with Laura, Ugo, and Mathieu, already named here, at the Schola Cantorum. And this is precisely why we are gathered here for this conference. Over 4 half days, we will examine the unique source and in its material and cultural dimensions. We will explore the wide and eclectic repertoire of the manuscript, Latin, German songs, liturgical plays too. We will address the challenges of the digital edition with the musical material when the musical material is so elusive, and the broader issues of reconstruction. We will also consider how performers have approached the medieval Carmina Burana in earlier times. 3 concerts will present ways of giving voice and sound back to them, arising from the work carried out by Marc Levon, Katarina Livianic, and Baptiste Romain with students of the Schola, as they explore new ways of engaging with the sound of the texts and of the melodies, and being charmed by what Guido of Arezzo called a double melody. Indeed, in chapter 17 of his Micrologus, Guido tells us, "Ad cantum redigitur, omne quod dicetur." Everything that is spoken can be rendered as song. We often see verses that are harmonious and mutually responsive, to the point that you may marvel at a kind of consonance of language. If a musical response is added to it, you will be charmed by a double melody, unquote. So, after this nice quotation by Guido, probably you all know, I will give some practical information. Conference material, if you don't have them already, and badges are available at the welcome desk for all lecture and concert participants. Birgit Leber will be there is there, and also Brigitte Schaffner for practicalities if you have any question. You can access WLAN, WLAN, via EduRoam or using our public FHNW you have to register a cellular number for this, and there are all instructions on the board next to Birgit and Brigitte at the back of the room there. If you need any help with your PowerPoint presentation or other slideshow, please don't hesitate to ask Andy Westerman here on my right. And yes, each paper should last about 45 minutes, including 5 or 10 minutes of discussion. We will make the discussion each time after the paper. So since the conference is being streamed, it is also essential if you want to speak, asking questions, participate to this discussion, that you take a microphone. There will be in person circulating microphones. And very important, coffee breaks take place in the cafeteria, down the corridor to the right. Restrooms are in the cafeteria basement, and also near the lecture hall. And for the two of the 3 concerts will be held in the neighboring church, Leonardskirche. And the presentation by Anne-Zoe Rionman on Friday late afternoon, as you can see in the flyer, and the following concert will take place in another room, not this room, but in Kleiner Saal, a few steps across the inner courtyard. Simply follow the group. I think that's all what I had to say. Oh, yes, the last very, very important thing. For students who are here, you can get credit points. You just have to be there at least half a day, and you have to go to Brigitte or Birgit and write your name in a legible manner on the sheet. Thank you.
So I'd like to also thank Christelle and I'm only going to say 2 words for inviting us to play. As Martin Kirnbauer said, we are not aiming to be authentic. Christelle asked the alta cappella class for a Beitrag, for a little performance. This is the alta cappella class. Take it or leave it. Or part of the alta cappella class. So just one more little medley. I suppose it's becoming more, I don't know.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, students. I will be your chair for this afternoon, and we start directly with the first paper. Unfortunately, I have to announce that Giulia Gabrielli can't be here with us for family reasons. She is not ill, which is a good news for her and for us, but she can't be here. So kindly, Uri Smilanski steps in and will read her paper. However, I will introduce her. Giulia Gabrielli studied music, piano voice, and musicology in different places in Trento, Cremona, Münster, and Graz, and where she earned her PhD in musicology with a work on liturgical musical manuscripts of Bolzano and Bressanone. So, related to the topic she will talk about. Her research focuses on the study of musical sources from the very same place, Trentino and South Tyrol regions, and she has published monographs and articles about musical sources from especially these sources. I would only quote a few. Il canto fratto nei manoscritti alla Fondazione Biblioteca San Bernardino di Trento, published in 2005, or Die liturgischen Musikhandschriften in Bozen und Brixen, 2019. And beside teaching, she is active in music pedagogy and singing. And she is associate professor in musicology at the Free University of Bolzano, Bozen-Bolzano, Brixen campus. So, and she serves as a coordinator for the Progetto di Rilevanti Interesse Nazionale, I like these Italian titles, which is called Michael Multimedia Italian Charmed Archive of Liturgical Melodies and Text, 14th to 18th century. And her introduction paper is on the Codex Buranus in the context of exactly the South Tyrolean sources she has studied so much. Thank you, Uri, for stepping in.
It's a pleasure. I apologize in advance if I murder any of the pronunciation of some of the people and places involved. So, I begin. First of all, I'd like to thank our dear colleagues Christelle, principal investigator of the project, and Laura for their invitation to open this conference. It is a great honor for me to, and of course, it's a pleasure to be part of this important project. Unfortunately, serious family matters prevent me from being present at the conference with you all, or even joining online. I am, however, happy to engage in dialogue. You will find my email at the end of the presentation, and I'll be delighted if you wish to contact me. Jokingly, I might say that perhaps the reason I was asked to open this conference is that the Buranus and I probably come from the same region, South Tyrol, which is a land full of manuscripts and also very good wine. I believe the Buranus can be a bit like that too. Like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, the name of the Buranus is very well known today, even to the general public, thanks to Carl Orff, but still full of irony and mystery, with something ever-changing and elusive, sicut luna. But what do we know about it? If we consider the famous 5 W's, some things are clear after 200 years of research. What it is and its contents. A songbook intended to contain song lyrics and music. The texts are indeed there, about 250 poems in different languages, Latin, German, and Provençal. The music, however, is much smaller in number, about 50 pieces with German adiastematic neumes. We cannot reconstruct the melodies for all of these pieces. When it was written, around 1230, with later additions, some by several decades. Why? Something is known or can at least be supposed, perhaps used for study and performance in a monastic school, by whom 2 main copyists, plus at least 30 others, whom added neumes and texts over the centuries. Their identities remain unknown. Where? Many hypotheses have been made about the place or places of writing, but the geographical origin remains a subject of debate. In my paper, I'd like to focus precisely on this aspect. Based on the contents, the language, or rather the languages, and the characteristics of the script, we deduce that the manuscript comes from a border zone between the Germanic and the Romance words. In recent decades, the hypotheses have been in contention for primacy. 2 hypotheses have been in contention for primacy: South Tyrol and the more eastern area, Bithynia and Styria. Furthermore, the fact that it was written over a relatively long period, the many scribal hands, etc., but above all, the presence of Augustinian elements have led scholars to favor 2 Augustinian abbeys, Novacella, Neustift in South Tyrol, and Seckau, which were also connected, incidentally, in the Middle Ages. In recent decades, the choice seemed to lean towards South Tyrol, and in particular, a micro-region that includes Novacella and the nearby episcopal city of Bressanone, 3 kilometers south. In his recent contribution titled Locating the Codex Buranus, Notational Context, Charles Brewer makes a statement that is amusing but true. Attempts to locate the provenance of the Codex Buranus have been a changing refrain in scholarship of the manuscript. These studies could form a medieval Baedeker guide to South Bavaria, Styria, Carinthia, and the South Tyrol, and the cultural institutions that may have provided the context and resources to produce this manuscript. What I proposed to you today, however, is the chronicle of a real journey in South Tyrol. Why? Because the Free University of Bolzano, Freie Universität Bozen, has promoted and financed a long research project on the liturgical musical manuscripts in South Tyrol, which until then had been little or not at all studied or known. Before showing the results of the research, I'd like to show you some maps to understand how the territory looked in the Middle Ages. In the first map, we have so-called historical Tyrol, formed in the northernmost part by North Tyrol with Innsbruck by the current South Tyrol in the center, with the cities of Bressanone, Brixen to the east and Bolzano, Bozen, and Merano, Meran to the west, and Trentino with Trento to the south. As we can see from the map, South Tyrol, the heart of historical Tyrol, the area that interests us most right now, was divided between the dioceses of Trento, Chur, and Bressanone. Each of these belonged to 3 different ecclesiastical provinces, Trento to Aquileia, Chur to Mainz, and Bressanone to Salzburg. In the next slides, you can see the places where the Tyrolean monastic foundations were located in the Middle Ages. Thanks to a project promoted by the University of Bolzano over the last 17 years in South Tyrol, I have catalogued with some valuable collaborations about 200 manuscripts and a multitude of fragments. The starting point for this long field research was Giacomo Baroffio's repertoire, Iter Liturgicum Italicum, or ILI in the table. These materials have already been partially studied by various scholars. For now, I will limit myself to pointing out that among these, there is a 14th century manuscript preserved in Bolzano, but originating in Bressanone, which will be useful later. Our journey begins here, in the Abbey of Novacella or Neustift. This abbey has received particular attention in the University of Bolzano study. Here we did not limit ourselves to searching for and cataloging liturgical books, but also to considering every type of medieval fragment, even outside the liturgical or musical realm. Why? Precisely to verify the hypothesis that the Codex Buranus was compiled in this abbey. The research was conducted in 2015 by Gianata Brusa in Novacella and Giovanni Varelli in Innsbruck, and also included the fragments preserved in Incunabula and Cinquecentine, 16th century printed books of the University and State Library of Tyrol. The results, unfortunately, were not able to provide sufficient evidence to attribute the Codex Buranus to Novacella. It must also be said, however, that much of the ancient book material was dispersed or destroyed over the centuries. For an idea of the type of fragment, I show you a leaf taken from a noted breviary dated to the end of the 12th century. This fragment, and let's see now the reverse side, was cited by the philologist Georg Stier in 1982 in support of his proposal that the Codex Buranus originated in Novacella Abbey. Already convinced by philological and liturgical evidence, Stier had started looking at South Tyrol as the Codex's homeland. He had considered, in fact, certain textual characteristic of the German dialect, particularly the spelling of diphthongs and the use of some verbal forms relevant in defining its origin. And these usages are characteristic of the Bresanon area, not of Seckau, which, as we have seen, was the other plausible option. So he sent a picture of this fragment that we are looking at to 3 scholars for a consultation. 2 of the 3 experts found that the notation of this fragment could be compatible with the Buranus. This, instead, is a fragment of a 13th century antiphonary. It is particularly interesting because it contains the office of the patron saints of Bresanon, Ingenuinus and Albuinus. It is, therefore, the oldest fragment of Novacella that, unlike the first one I showed you, we can attribute to a local scriptorium. But let's return to the topic in a moment. Concurrently with this research, Ursula Stampfer undertook a project to catalogue the medieval manuscripts held in the abbey. Many scholars from various sectors participated in this project. Gionata Brusa and I were responsible for the musicological sector. The catalogue was published in 2021 by the Austrian Academy of Sciences and is available online for free. Let's go back to Bresanone. On the Baroque facade of the cathedral, we find the statues of the 3 patrons, Saint Cassian, Saint Ingenuinus, and Saint Albuin. Their office, as we have seen, was widespread in the diocese. Here we see an example taken from a Liber Ordinarius kept at the Collegiate Church of San Candido, Inichen, in German, originating from Bresanone. The manuscript is important because it bears witness to a liturgical source, albeit without notation, compiled in Bresanone or Novacella during the years of the Buranus. The musicologist Charles Brewer cites another source of the office of the patron of saints also from Bresanone, but now kept in Bolzano. This is the so-called Calendarium Winteri from the early 14th century. Here we can see a detail in comparison with a Novacella manuscript 15063, which contains the diastematic version of some pieces from the patron saint's offices. It was precisely this manuscript with the offices of some saints, as I was saying, that led Brewer to think that the Buranus could have been written in Bresanone, perhaps in the Domschule. Although rigorous comparative studies between the Codex and other sources, both textual and musical, remain lacking, and as a matter of fact have not yet resolved the doubts about the manuscript's provenance, I am firmly convinced that we are moving in the right direction. We must return ad fontes. This means that if we want to try and establish the scribal context for the manuscript, we must now study and compare as many extant sources as possible. Only in this way can we verify the existence of any direct or indirect relationship with it. In our case, our motto will therefore be not only Novacella. Before continuing, let's return for a moment to the map of the historical Tyrol to better understand the geography of the macro region we will now be moving through. This map is taken from an important bilingual publication in Italian and German dedicated to the various forms of ecclesiastical collegiality in Tyrol. The map highlights the foundations within the different dioceses into which the territory was divided. The Diocese of Trento is colored red, the Diocese of Bressanone in green. We must remember that for centuries these two dioceses constituted the southernmost tip of the German Empire due to their strategic position. Starting from the 11th century, the emperor conferred upon the two titular bishops not only spiritual but also temporal power, making them sovereigns of the two territories and thus establishing the prince-bishoprics. As we can clearly see from this map, Bressanone was at the heart of a large diocese that extended mostly beyond the Alps, even reaching Innsbruck. The diocese, although located in a territory of passage and transit, was decisively north-oriented. It belonged to the ecclesiastical province of Salzburg, and the language and culture were clearly Germanic. Further south, the Diocese of Trento included a good part of Trentino, but also the central area of the current South Tyrol. This diocese was clearly multilingual and multicultural. The southern part spoke Romance languages, while the north, including the city of Bolzano, was predominantly German-speaking. In this so-called Deutsche Anteil of the Diocese of Trentino, the presence and coexistence of the two cultures and two languages was very marked, much more marked compared to the Diocese of Bressanone. What could then be other possible provenances? The first step is to investigate the other Augustinian houses in South Tyrol and Trentino. Novacella had two sister Augustinian foundations, and they had very different fates. The Provostry of San Michele al Adige, Sankt Michael an der Etsch, and the Canonry of Santa Maria in Augia, Sancta Maria in der Au in Bolzano. Both belonged to the Diocese of Trentino and were founded just a few years after Novacella. These foundations don't exist anymore, but at the time they were significant religious and cultural centers. Let's look at them in detail, starting with the oldest. San Michele was a provostry located 20 kilometers north of Trento, just beyond the Avisio River. This, for centuries, was the border between Italy and Germany, where two other very important rivers converge, the Noce and the Adige. Its history has many parallels with Novacella. It was founded by the Bishop of Trento, Altmann, 1124 to 1149, just 2 years after Novacella was founded by Hartmann, 1142, in the same context of reform desired by the bishops of Salzburg. And the wind of reform blew so strongly that it also reached the Diocese of Trento. Despite its strategic position, the Provostry of San Michele was in fact a small institution and had one peculiarity. It was a private monastery of the Counts of Abbiano, and the Counts ruled over those lands until the 13th century, when they yielded power to the Counts of Tyrol. In its origins, it was probably inhabited by canons from Altmann's circle, but for a large part of its history, it was inhabited by few monks until it was suppressed in the 19th century. Its current forms date back to the 17th century, and it is the site of Italy's oldest enological school. I did mention this is a land of good wine. Its library and archive are largely lost, but fortunately we still have some sources. Among these, for example, we have a 17th century transcription of some medieval documents, which was studied by Hannes Obermeier. According to the information contained therein, it seems that there was no internal school there. We can, however, hypothesize the presence of a scriptorium. All musical sources are lost, all but one. This fragment of the office of St. Vigilius, patron saint of the Diocese of Trento, now kept in the State Archive of Trento. Until the 18th century, a similar fragment existed in the parish church of Bressanone, which was also dedicated to San Michele. It had been seen and transcribed by a local historian, John Resch. but was lost as early as the beginning of the 20th century. Its existence, however, cannot guarantee a connection between San Michele all'Adige and Bresanone. Of the ancient canonry of San Maria in Augia, or Au, near Bolzano, only ruins remain, and the tombstone of the foundress, Mathilde de Vallée, now preserved in the convent of Gries. We can reconstruct the appearance of the original church based on that relief. There she is. The canonry, founded in 1165 or 66, was later transferred due to river floods from Au to Gries, with various renovations that led to the current structures, which remained in Augustinian hands until the 19th century. In 1845, the convent was donated to the Benedictine congregation of Muri, exiled from Switzerland, and the Benedictines still live there in what is called the Abbey of Muri-Gries. Gries, at the time of the Buranus, had another name, Keller. This is because, as we already know, we are talking about lands famous for their wine. All the great Bavarian abbeys, from Tegernsee to Benedictsbauern, had plots of lands and properties in Gries. Unfortunately, no documents survive from the first centuries of the canonry. The archives were looted in a revolt in 1525, but it is known that it was connected to Benedictbauern and also Marienberg, a Benedictine monastery in Valpusteria, by Gebetsbrüderschaft, a prayer confederation attested in the Benedictbauer documents. From the rich archive of the canonry, only a few 12th and 13th century parchment remain, now housed in the Abbey of Muri-Gries. The oldest musical sources attributable to Augia are 3 liturgical books with notation dating back to the 14th and 15th century. They belong to 3 city churches run by Augustinians and to the nearby Dominican convent. The large fragment of polyphony from the 15th century found in this archive in 2015, here we see it compared with Trento 93, perhaps belonged precisely to this convent or to the parish school of Bolzano. But we must consider other places. In San Candido, in German Innichen, there is the oldest monastic foundation in Tyrol. It is a Benedictine monastery founded in 769 by the Duke of Bavaria, Tassilo III, as a base for Christian missions among the Slavs. It is placed in the locality of India, Innichen, also known as Campo Gelao, frozen lands. Today, the Tobiaco Basin, where there was an ancient and important Roman road. It was a meeting point between the Bavarian Germanic world of the north and the eastern Slavic world. It was the heart of Val Pusteria, which connects the Alps with Eastern Europe, but also through Cadore with Venice. Innichen is, in fact, one of the first Bavarian settlements in Tyrol. Since 783, when Abbot Atto of Innichen became Bishop of Freising, San Candido became a possession of the Prince Bishopric of Freising as a Hofmark, manorial estate, until the secularization of 1803, when it was transferred to the possessions of the County of Tyrol. The 8th century Benedictine monastery remained as such until about 920. Within 50 years, it was re-established as a collegiate church, and from the 12th century, we also find an annexed school. The collegiate church archives recount countless events that occurred over the centuries, and these sources have been meticulously studied in recent decades by a linguist, local historian, and Germanist whose name is Egon Kühnbacher. We know, for example, from the chronicles that in the second half of the 16th century, the moral conduct of the canons was questionable. We have documents describing some of them as concubinari, but also stupratores, rapists, and carpulatores, drunkards, more devoted to women, wine, and nightly raids than to the spiritual duties of the community. One canon was even accused of counterfeiting money. my comment, I'm not sure how that order of sins goes. Okay. Thus, arising from this situation, in the years immediately following the Council of Trent, there was a recognized need to reform the spiritual life and habits of monastic communities. And the life of the collegiate church in Invention was profoundly affected by these reforms. The presence of a school is documented, as we have said, from the 12th century. And the first teachers whose name we have is a certain Aimar Magister, cited as a witness in a territorial dispute. It was not uncommon for judicial events of this type to occur. The collegiate church has always had exchanges and disagreements with the lords of Cadore and with Venice regarding their borders. Regarding musical sources, San Candino hosts the oldest manuscript with pneumatic notation in the province of Bolzano, Oxford Canonical Liturgical 341, written at the end of the 12th century. The manuscript contains the liturgy of San Cassiano, and we can argue that it was written definitely for, but perhaps also by, a local scriptorium. The final part features notation of some sequences in German neumes written by different hands. The rich archive of the collegiate church has been entirely microfilmed in Bolzano. As with the Novacella case, the content of the medieval fragments in the library and archive warrants careful study. Going even further south, we reach Trento, another authentic border zone. Though part of the Romance area of the empire, it was nonetheless politically under German imperial control. And it was the site of a cathedral school dating back to the 10th century. 200 years after the compilation of the Buranus, 6 of the famous 7 Trento polyphonic codices were produced here. However, I would tend not to exclude the parish church of Bolzano from the list of possibilities. Here, in ancient times, a community of 7 priests lived. This one you're seeing is the 15th century church, the place where Johannes Lupi, one of the scribes of the Trent Codices, left his polyphonic manuscripts as a legacy before leaving on pilgrimage. The Romanesque church was as large as the Besançon Cathedral. We should deepen the study of archived documents concerning the masters and the school. The context of Bolzano also deserves, in my opinion, a special attention. This is where North and South truly meet in medieval South Tyrol. The notarial profession, for example, has German content and Italian customs, including graphic forms. The handwriting includes the use of the famous C with cedilla mentioned by Stier and other scholars. And the South is also present from an artistic point of view, as in the Giotto school frescoes of the Dominican convent. I am convinced that searching for further fragments in South Tyrol, perhaps in Chiusa, Brunico, and especially San Candido, can give us further clues about the context in which the Buranus was compiled. And at the same time, textual philological research should continue, taking advantage of the available archive material, such as that of the Diocese Archive of Bresanone, to investigate the matter thoroughly. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm afraid I can't necessarily take questions.
Yes, but thank you, Uri, for presenting the paper. Thank you to Giulia Gabrielli for her interesting paper. It's a little bit travel agency and wine merchant work. We can't discuss anything with her, but are there any comments or ideas which somebody would like to share now? Would be possible. Mark Everest.
Thank you, Uri, for reading the paper, and thank you to Giulia. in absentia. So it's a question of methodology, I guess, isn't it? One of the ways of trying to establish a logical origin for a book like the Codex Buranus is closer and closer and closer readings of the texts. But actually, what's being proposed here is actually a very different kind of approach, and one which I'm familiar with from studies of French and Parisian books, which is assembling as large a corpus of cognate materials as is humanly possible. And this seems to me entirely convincing and plausible, and for me actually very helpful. I mean, to actually have a view, even if it's not a particularly identifiable provenance, for the book, that gives us at least a way of talking about the kind of geographical and even topological kind of environment for the book. That's all I have to say, really. But I enjoyed the paper.
Thank you.
May I add something, because I exchanged a lot with Giulia while we were both preparing our papers, and in the Codex Buranus, a further clue to its provenance maybe is the fact that what many scholars have called Provençal or corrupted French, or some words here and there that are in the Codex Buranus actually are very, very close to modern Rheto-Romanic languages, or Latin, which is also Rheto-Romanic language, Romance, language. So we are still seeking for the confirmation of a person which is a specialist of Latin in Italian, in Italy, Paul Vidosot. But yes, this is really orienting the provenance in that multilingual region where Romance languages were spoken, as well as German, with very strong Bavarian Alemannic, with hints of Alemannic features. Yeah.
In my own voice, I also want to join in with the richness of the paper and how interesting the findings are, with the small and unavoidable proviso of both a reliance on survival of records and inattention. It's amazing that the University of Bolzano supported such a project, but until we have parallel projects also everywhere else, that's where we have materials where there's also some likelihood that such a thing could have originated from, we are still kind of have one hand tied behind our back, because we are just taking the things that fit until we have a complete picture. So I mean, I'm very much convinced that this could be the direction to go, but I think it's really important to keep having the kind of devil's advocate as well, trying to figure out if we have also other contexts where similar research would also yield some sources that seem very close in behavior for sometimes very local reasons rather than large geopolitical ones, whereby you have a specific combination of 10 people who cause multilingual behavior rather than it being a political place when such things happen anyway.
I was stimulated to a second thought going in this direction. The Codex Buranus texts especially has studied so much in the last 60, 70 years. And only now somebody came to the conclusion, to the idea, oh, this is quite normal, this is Latin, something which is normally, but it was because the people then researching were blind, politically blind, because this special region is so much disputed. Is it Italy, it is German, or it is local, etc. So research stopped because it was not allowed to see something which seems, if I understand rightly, is quite obvious. So that it is not only spreading more projects on other regions and to see similar things, but it's another point to look at the research already done and move away the political blindness which is there. So as in medicine, it's normally to use research data from earlier projects and look anew, which could be helpful as well, and not only to start new projects, which is always good because research means work for researchers, which we are. Okay, it's perhaps not a very helpful comment. So if there are no more to say on this, we like to thank again Gabrielli and of course Uri. And I would like to call the next speaker, Kelly Landerkin. Okay, now I can introduce our next speaker, and I always waited for the moment I can present my colleague Kelly. And to tell the truth about her, no, I don't. We'll do that now. Kelly studied voice, music theory, music pedagogy, and historical performance practice on many places, Hawaii, Bloomington, before she came to Basel as a Fulbright scholar. It's a moment we met many, many years ago. Here she pursued postgraduate school work in medieval music at the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis and the University of Basel. Her work focused on new song repertories of the High Middle Ages, modal improvisation in liturgical monophy, historical music pedagogy, and so on. Research projects on these topics were funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, 2011 to 2013, about performance conventions of Aquitanian Nova Cantica, and following the wonderful research project on Ina Lore, an early music zealot, which led to a book I can recommend, written by Anne Smith about Ina Lore, who is one of the important founders of the Schola and one of the few of the people of the first Schola generation with some knowledge, at least, in early music. And Kelly collaborates with the Corpus Monodicum team in Würzburg University, with the preparation of editions of liturgical dialogues. And she is my colleague in the management team of the Schola and here she leads the medieval studies programs and the master programs in music pedagogy. So, and she was a singer as well, and here I stop, but this is important because her experience as a singer, which started before coming to Basel and which led, among other things, to be a kind of assistant of a person who will be now one of the main characters of her speech. I won't name him now, but you'll hear it in a moment. And this experience as a medieval singer on the one side and a researcher on this performance practice history as well as the repertory leads to this paper, Invention and Imitation in Early Recordings of the Carmina Burana. I'm looking very much forward. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Martin, for this lengthy and interesting description of who I am, apparently. And good afternoon. Maybe after the break, the other things. So good afternoon. I would like to give us today an oral backdrop for our discussions over the next few days. Specifically, I'll be discussing the musical influences and interpretations of the early recording history of the Codex Buranus, focusing on the first three ensembles to have made their mark on the oral heritage of this manuscript. The earliest was released over 60 years ago, and in the meantime, the floodgates now open. The recordings devoted to the medieval source number well over 50, as Kirsten Yeri remarks, quite an astonishing sum and an enormous cultural reach. As the earliest, Thomas Binkley's 1964 and 68 recordings with the Studio der Frühen Musik may represent the first evidence of a cultural moment that was already in the air, or perhaps mark a stunningly novel approach soon to be ripe for imitation, or perhaps both, because within a few short years of their release, both Konrad Ruland's Capella Antiqua München in 1968 and the Klebencic consort of René Klebencic, starting in 1974, produced their own, themselves followed by countless others, including some artists in this room today. My connection. This topic is personal to me. From 1993 to 95, I was a student at Indiana University, pursuing my master's degree, and I served as the last teaching and research assistant of Tom Binkley before his death. This is a snapshot of us after his last concert, where we performed Procurans Odium from the Carmina Burana. My first homework assignment from him was a recording critique in his class on medieval performance practice. I chose a recording of an ensemble I had not yet encountered, the Klebencic consort. On submission day, Binkley curtly refused to accept my critique, saying, "Choose something else, anything else. Klebencic should come up with some original ideas and stop copying mine." Although this felt rash and proprietorial, it seemed to me that he was actually addressing fundamental issues regarding creative invention, imitation, and professional integrity. The recollection of this interaction inspired me to look at this relationship more closely and served as an impulse for this paper. Let's now turn to the recordings of the Codex Buranus themselves. Of the over 250 items in the catalog, depending on how you count them, around 80 have been recorded to date, over 50 already by the first three ensembles. Around 50 are at least partially neumed in the Codex, and several of these, as well as other items, are neumed in concordances. The early recordings lean heavily on these concordances for the realizations of their interpretations, including by borrowing existing melodies, as in the case of Bacche Bene Venies, and the assumed contrafact Jubilemus Regi Nostro from the play of Daniel. Perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that the same titles crop up time and again. At least 20 pieces have been recorded more than 10 times, with the numerous Bacche Bene Venies ironically leading the pack at 25 individual recordings to date. Of the 30-ish pieces recorded by Thomas Binkley, over half were also recorded by Ruland and or Klebencic. Considering that Binkley only chose to record pieces that were either neumed in the Buranus manuscript or in a concordance, this choice is an obvious reason for considerable overlap with the ensembles that followed him. The Studio der Frühen Musik was founded in 1959, and its 8th recording was its first Carmina Burana album. This became an immediate hit, as is illustrated by its earliest critique 1 year after its release, welcoming the appearance of a perfectly delightful collection of medieval songs. Binkley has provided a rhythmic shape for these songs and a disposition of voices and instruments, which, whatever its actual authenticity, certainly has the ring of truth. So what made this ensemble so special? The studio's lively, entertaining concerts were underpinned, as Binkley remarks in his 1977 article for the Basler Jahrbuch, by the wide breadth and depth of influences they integrated into their music making. Not only did the ensemble members profit from classical musical training and a solid academic musicological background, they were also open to inspiration from the various folk musics gaining popularity at the time. This allowed them to experiment with a variety of approaches to different pieces, which Binkley justifies by the fact that its concordances were geographically widespread, proving the international and interregional popularity of the repertory. On the one hand, as John Haynes writes, while Binkley sought to depart from earlier recorded interpretations, in its literalism, the studio followed the example of such performers as Max Miley and Russell Oberlin. Miley was a key figure in the early days of the Schola. Perhaps a good example of this literalism in performance is the studio's recording of Procuron's Odium. Let's listen. I say that with tremendous trepidation. It worked during rehearsal, Andy. We have it on mute. Okay. Here we go. Etc. It does not employ any extra instruments or added ornamentation, nor does it engage with overt contrasts in the performance of the text. It just presents the piece through a lyrical legato vocality, an even balance of voices, and an unadorned musical structure. Alongside this approach, the studio also set out aesthetically on a new path, bringing forth, in the words of Nicholas Kenyon, a radically different sound, which seemed to set the bar for the new ensembles establishing themselves close on its heels, such as the Klemenčić consort. The new element in this radically different sound is an influence from outside European musical traditions, building upon the assumption of a lively intercultural exchange, even in areas of strife. As John Haynes writes, in reference to the 1964 album, this ushered the listener into an unprecedented recording musical landscape, combining jangling tambourines and bells, a Middle Eastern rabab and darbuka, and the fluty subtlety of boy soprano and countertenor voices. We can hear an example of this direction in Binkley's recording of Ecce Gratum et Optatum, the joyous ode to spring, with tenor voice, lute, viol, organetto, and tambourines from the Orient, as he says in his liner notes, in the prelude and interludes.
Omnia,
etc. He looked to living traditions that offered ways to integrate new sound colors, new ways of plucking and strumming, and new combinations of voices and non-European instruments. They experimented with melodic ornamentation over drones and monophonic playing typical of Arab Andalusian traditions, as well as the use of percussion instruments, often to support not only accentuation in simple dance tunes, but also the complex layering of rhythmic structures. An example of what Binkley called the Southern or Arab style was related to the Andalusian nuba. It is well documented that Binkley's interest in his tradition was not fleeting but quite intense, as can be attested, for instance, through his connection to the Moroccan ensemble Fez, which came to Basel in 1977 on his introduction. Let's listen. Goes on, and it's worth a listen. A contrasting approach is audible in this clip of Axe Phoebus Aureo, sung by an alto voice and a simple rhythmic meter accompanied by lute and rebec. The effect is lyrical, even dreamlike, quasi-improvisatory in the instrumental accompaniment, and highly rhetorical in its connection between music and text. It goes on more rhetorically as the piece develops. Turning to the Crusade song Nomina Solemnibus, we hear more complexity, especially from this, its second strophe, sung by tenor voice with lute, viol, and flute.
Corps nobilissima prima regem habuit, in ha curbe maxima domino complacuit, in ha cropta hominem crucifigi voluit, hic super apostolos spiritus inconuit, urbs insignis atquam ignis venit amnis singulis.
Creative license is audible in both terms of the rhythmic presentation, including overlapping layers of metric structures, and the copious and varied improvisation, ranging from simple ad hoc ornaments all the way to prescripted counter melodies. Perhaps what is most surprising about the recordings is that the clean lyric austerity of Procuran's Odium sits quite comfortably next to Arab Andalusian influences in Ecce Gratum and beyond. And this pushing of boundaries continued through the years. During my time with him in the 90s, he continued to integrate ethnomusicological studies into his teaching, here with Balkan music, there with Indian or with Puerto Rican traditions, to push his students beyond their preconceived boundaries for medieval interpretation. Now I'd like to turn to Konrad Ruland and his Capella Antiqua München, founded in 1956, the second ensemble to release a recording of items from the manuscript. After a decade of recordings of 15th and 16th century music, the late 60s represents for the ensemble a departure and expansion of repertoires in all directions, both later, as with the Monteverdi Vesper, and earlier, as with the Buranus manuscript. Perhaps it is no coincidence that Ruland's ensemble was based in Munich, in the direct proximity of Binkley's studio. Their 1968 recording of Carmina Burana presents 13 tracks, only 2 of which are not present on one of Binkley's 2 recordings. Although less widely received, the Deutsche Ärzteblatt writes the following. Konrad Ruland integrates concordances from other manuscripts in order to reach, if not a historically accurate, at least a responsible presentation of medieval music that will charm the listener. Whether or not Ruland took inspiration for the idea and programming from Binkley's Carmina Burana, I haven't found any evidence of a direct connection on it. His liner notes present an independent approach to his performance decisions, first and foremost in terms of his understanding of the source. It is not possible to derive melodies from the manuscript. Attempts to do so run the risk of creating something new, making one's own innovations not only likely but necessary. Only through parallel tradition in other manuscripts has this problem been solved. Whether these certainly genuine melodies are in accord with the neumes of the Carmina Burana cannot be surely determined. I find it fascinating that creating something new is formulated rather negatively. His approach shows remarkable respect and deference toward the source, thus placing him in contrast to Binkley's attempts to stretch well beyond the boundaries of the written document. Ruland's liner notes describe the colorful instrumentation added to the voice parts of his performing versions. Sometimes they double the voices, sometimes accompany them, often using percussion to accentuate the metric progress of a verse line. On the face of it, he describes a very similar approach to that of Binkley. Let's listen to his Nomina Solemnibus.
Nomina solemnibus trahi solemniacum, solemni centigitur, omnes pretem monatum, visibi virilia, resecavi serracum, illum hinc excipimus, quasi demoniacum, ipse solus lugiat, prius appudiacum. Exultimus et cantimus canticum victoriae, et clamimus vastivimus laures Digi gloriae, vi salvavitur bem Davida paganis hodie. Vestur agitur, dientes collitur, invadatum tranquitur, et amare quinquitur, Sanctus agas helvitur, Jerusalem perimpitur, et Christianus rempitur, diem moramus igitur.
In his liner notes, he explains the decision to show the formal structure of the text through the use of his ensemble forces. In a tiered approach, the verses begin with a solo voice and tambourine here, building in the second section to 2 unison voices with tambourine and bells, finally culminating in the choral presentation of refrains, with tutti voices in octaves and added recorder and drums. Despite the conscious utilization of color and instrumentation, the interpretation remains fairly close to the written source, and other than the doubling of voices and instruments on the same line, does not explore things that we would consider affects from extra-European musicalities. A different, more restrained approach is on display in Axe Phoebus Aureo.
Axe Phoebus Aureo Celsiora lustrat, et nitore roseo radius illustrat. Venus alta cubile facie florante, florem nato simile dat Phebo favente. Aurarum suavium gratia juvante, sonat nemus avium voce modulante. Illuminat verule teria retractat, dum cadendo merule carmina coactat. Iam Giulia.
In comparison to Binkley's recording, we can hear the jauntier tempo, higher performing pitch, and the purely a cappella monophonic performance. Tenor voices sing in unison pairs, with tutti refrains also in unison. There are no obvious variations in dynamic, tempo, or discernible mood, offering a clean interpretation of the piece quite close to the source. A third example shows the lyric vocality of his aesthetics in Procurans Odium. Although the intonation is not always spot on, he's working with amateurs. There is beauty in the linear understanding of the melody.
Procurans Odium, effectu proprimo, vixte transivum, caudet intensivum, nexus is cordivum, ipsa detractio, sic per contrarium,
This is actually quite similar to Binkley's recording, restrained, allowing the complex polyphony to shine through its clarity. Neither feel highly rhetorical or emotionally laden. When compared to Binkley in general, Rouland's musical realizations are less likely to exhibit improvisation or added elements. His strength lies in the employment of amateur a cappella voices in the European tradition as the vehicles of performance, singing with the simplicity and integrity of interpretation to the best of their abilities. The third ensemble I would like to present is the Klemencic Consort, founded by René Klemencic in 1969. With around 40 pieces across 5 albums between 1974 and 78, this catalog represents the most songs recorded from the Codex by a single group. Klemencic was clearly aware of the recordings of Binkley and Rouland, as they're listed in the bibliography of his performing edition. Almost half of the pieces recording are also on Binkley's discs, and 2 are shared with Rouland alone. Around a dozen are new, some realized through concordances, some as new compositions set to unnumed texts. Following Binkley, Klemencic also consciously embraced extra-European influences. In his liner notes, he writes, "We have tried to underline the international character of the songs by using different interpretations. For example, heavy Arabic influence, some, none at all." Let's listen to some of his ideas for the Carmina Burana. First, I'd like to play you one of the no less than 3 versions he recorded of Procurans Odium. This track gives us both a monophonic and a polyphonic interpretation.
Procurans Odium, effectu proprio, with letra ensium, gaudet intensio, nexus est cardium, ipsa detratio, sic per contrario, avos penetrio, fibric provisio, in hoc amansium, ex conditio.
It goes on like that for a little while. The approach couldn't be more different from the purely vocal a cappella renditions of Binkley and Rouland. The rough, non-classic vocality with its dramatic glissandi is complemented by a hurdy-gurdy accompaniment and shawms, drones, and drum. A striking contrast to this is offered in both versions of his Nomina Solemnibus. Here's the one with voices. On this track, voices are accompanied by bells and shawms, sometimes so loud that you can't hear the voices, as well as the drones and snares of the hurdy-gurdy. The monumental sound of the opening is repeated in the refrains, while the verses alternate high and low solo voices. Another approach is represented by Axe Febus Aureo. lyrically and dynamically sung in a beautiful acoustic. As we can hear, it moves at a faster tick than Binkley's, but at the same pitch and with a similar vocal aesthetic. An extreme example of a rhetorical interpretation is reflected in Klemenčić's Sic mea fata. Here's his translation of the opening lines. So I comfort my faith with song, my fate with song, as the swan does when near death. The rosy tint is gone from my face, sweet grief lies in my heart. Sorrow increases, pain grows stronger, strength flies from me, and I miserably die.
Sic mea fata cadendo solor, ut nece proxima facit color, roseus e fugitore color, blandus in est meo cor de dolor. Ora crescente, labare vigente, vigore labente, miser morior. Hey morior, hey morior, hey morior. Ut quod avem cogor et non amor.
With an approach similar to that of his Procurans Odium, this performance surely seeks to elicit an emotional response from the listener, even risking the clarity of the mode of the piece and arguably the intention of the text with its interpretive decisions. In comparison, Binkley's Sic mea fata, while exploiting a melding of influences, classical art music, folk music, and Arab Andalusian influence, approaches the piece with a more lyrical atmosphere.
Sic mea fata cadendo solor, ut nece proxima facit dolor, quandus serene o cor de dolor, roseus et fugitore color, pura Christem de l'amor vigente, vigore labente, miser morior, ambale pectora mica amor, oh morior, oh morior, oh morior.
The steady pulse of the drum and psaltery offers the singer the pop of movement and the foundation of a stable rhythmic structure, creating a more restrained interpretation in stark contrast to the decisions of Klemenčić. What I admire most in Klemenčić's performances is his disregard of performative boundaries, what is beautiful, what is expected, using all the tools in his kit to create a mood and tell a story. Not dissimilar to what I admire in Binkley's approach, but with often radically diverging aesthetic senses. As we can hear, there are no black or white answers to the questions of invention and imitation in recordings. Binkley certainly deserves credit for forging the path to this source and for introducing this wide palette of aesthetic possibilities in medieval performance to a wider audience. But the studio was itself inspired by Noah Greenberg's New York Pro Musica and even earlier by Arnold Dolmetsch, building upon the then current interest in Orientalism. So actually there was something in the air. The soundscape that Binkley continued to develop may have been emulated by many, but the offhanded allegations of imitation levied at Klemenčić can only hold water in the abstract sense of an approach that takes inspiration from other, especially Arab, cultural spaces. It does not translate directly to a musical interpretation of specific pieces. Here, each musician with his ensemble was able to create an individual space and transport his own statement and expression. Considering all of this, it is surprising that Tom Binkley has retreated into relative obscurity. I apparently left that out. There it is. Klemenčić's work is remembered. Binkley's isn't even mentioned on the Wikipedia page for Carmina Burana as having produced the first recordings of the manuscript. And recording Konrad Ruland, interestingly, he was never part of this larger debate. This quite respectable recording receded into the background behind more novel influences. There was little attempt to build upon his Carmina Burana to create a new sound with his ensemble in this repertoire, nor did he purport to want to. As a last thought, I would like to ask you, do these early recordings still speak to you today? For me, this study has somehow bridged the gap between then and now, and allowed me to appreciate not only the pioneering spirit and creativity of these ensembles, but the complete clarity of their artistic vision. Beyond the heritage of the classical tradition and the innovation of the early music movement in general, certainly both Klemenčić and Binkley were looking to living traditions and an international approach to inform their music making. This burst of creative invention did form a kind of interpretative consensus that still influences ensembles today, even as they continue to seek and find new ways to view the source. Of course, much has changed in our understanding of the music that affects our performance practice. Questions regarding mensurability, ideas of vocal technique, choices of ensemble formation, etc. But much has established itself and would not feel out of place on today's stage. A wider perspective on intercultural relationships, the phenomenon of instrumental accompaniment, and the role of improvisation, to name but a few. The Carmina Burana recordings are mirrors of their time. The source only offers us the beginning of the foundation for an interpretation. How wonderful if today's performers offer us a multitude of ways to read and hear it, each from their own perspective. Then I would welcome 50 more recordings of this priceless source. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I loved your paper. I think there are many people who loved it as well and have perhaps some comments to share. Aurea Dominguez.
Hi, Kelly. Well, thank you very much for your paper and for bringing recordings to stage. I was thinking when I was listening to those recordings about early music a little bit in general, because in the 60s and the 70s, the debate was very much into authenticity.
Into what?
Authenticity.
Yeah.
Like, we play like this because this is how it was intended to be. These kind of debates that were kind of broken in the 90s and so on. But in the 60s, they were very much that. But now, after listening to what you said and the recordings in medieval music and the Carmina Burana, I'm starting to wonder, was this authenticity debate mostly devoted or focused in the 17th or 18th century music, and then the medieval music was left out of the debate, or not? Or what are your ideas around this? Thank you.
The question is, it's a great question. How do you approach authenticity? For sources that have been non-sounding for 600, 700, 800 years. So I think that they did understand themselves as seeking, in a way, an authenticity, but how do you do it? What certainly in this area, for more secular medieval music in the 60s and 70s, they're looking toward living traditions as the only possible window into how do we get out of a classically trained tradition. So we are classical, we are in the early music movement, but what else is there? And Binkley talks, Binkley wrote a huge article, I think some of you may already know it, the 1977 Basel Jahrbuch article, where he talks about this is how I did it. This is what I think are the really important points to this. And he says things like, from everything that we can see from living folk traditions that we can trace back quite a while, he's got some principles. Mensurability. He really, he stood by this and said that things should be mensurable. It should have he doesn't see why. If it's in a poetic meter, if there's some kind of a verse form with strong and weak accentuation, why not? And he's looking toward things like Arab Andalusian style. He goes and does visits in India, in Morocco. He goes to the Balkans. He makes us read tons of stuff. But not only him, it's in the air. You know, Noah Greenberg is including the clay drums, the darbukas, in performances of the play of Daniel in the 1950s. So the question is, how does this continue to develop? But I would say from this is a search for something. But if you asked Binkley, or perhaps Klemencic, because he talks about it in his 1978 article, there's no way. There's no way to know. So how do we know? And Klemencic talks about a medievalism of the 20th century. What is a medieval performance practice for now? So he was looking toward this. I think there's an ambivalence. There's a highly questionable idea about what is the point of authenticity. And Binkley would say that's not the primary thing. You're a performer, your first thing is to go out there and make a connection with the audience, entertain people, move them, manipulate their emotions, but try to do it through something that has a foundation. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I do think that it's not a completely clear term at the time. Is what do they mean by authenticity and how are they trying to get into it?
But just to add here, I remarked that the presentation by the record company is leading to something else a little bit, original manuscript.
Oh, yeah.
And it's in the same series as these later early music stuff they put on the market. Even if Binkley, Klemencic, whoever, Roland, would like to contribute to this aspect, they were marketed like this.
Version original.
It's perhaps I can a bit comment the Roland side because I know it very well and he's not very well known in the early music community in this generation, not anymore. He is a trained musicologist. He was a student of Thrasybulus Georgiades in Munich, and he always tried to do things which are in an academic way right. And I was a student in school when I met him, and he was furious about Tom Binkley because he said he does things he cannot prove. It's all fiction. It's imagination. It's not what the sources tell us. Of course, we are doing the same discussion today on a different level, but it's always the same. And he always tried to not to do things which he cannot. He has no responsibility in an academic way. So his versions are very dry in a way and very clear. He always wanted to have a distinctive rhythmic structure, a bit more than it tells us the source. This was always a critic's. And telling about this ensemble, they were not amateurs. Most of them were music teachers in the schools. So, and as you should know, in Bavaria, the music teachers' studies are single studies. It's a training only for music in schools, nothing else. No mathematics, no history, no languages. It's only music. So they were quite highly trained musicians, but not singers, not instrumentalists in the how should I say, in the professional way we expect it nowadays. So it was a very, how should I say, yeah, there are many other aspects.
Yeah.
He was trained in the Bavarian tradition of church choirs coming from the 19th century, from the Sicilianistic movements. So there were different framing for his music making than for the other ensembles.
Yeah, absolutely. The funny thing is, I talked to David Fallows yesterday, because David Fallows was Tom Binkley's assistant a little bit after these recordings, and I just said, did he say anything about Ruland or Klemenčić? Because I was wondering if, he said some fairly ridiculous things to me, Binkley, but David said Binkley was furious with the other direction, that Ruland was taken seriously, that because his ensemble was only amateurs and that the critics put him forward as somebody who was working with a professional ensemble. But that Deutsche Ärzteblatt goes on to say, with 3 Ausrufezeichen, exclamation points, that he could do this with his amateur ensemble was incredible. So there's a lot of, it's fantastic. Thanks, Thomas, as somebody from the inside, knowing a bit more about that training. Very interesting how they're working in the same fields at around the same time, and they're a bit proprietorial about it, also, and trying to explain their approach. Mark.
Thank you. I enjoyed that enormously. It was a kind of blast from the past, because these are the recordings that I actually grew up with as a student. There's so many questions I have on the basis of what you said, and I just want to restrict myself to one, really, and that's the issue of mensurability from Binkley vis-à-vis Ruland. And exactly what the genealogy of that approach to mensurability actually is, because once you've taken away everything else, the rhythmic structure of the melody in both Binkley's recordings and Ruland's is identical. They're all strictly modal. And I'm just wondering where they come from. I'm assuming Binkley produced his own editions. You would know better than anybody else, and I bet Ruland did as well, right? So many of there almost were no editions of the music in concordant sources for that, for even the kind of mainstream conductor's repertory at that point. I mean, the earliest one I can think of is Janet Knapp's 1965 35 Conductus, which is a kind of TypeScript handwritten thing, which must have been hard to get hold of in 1965, certainly is now. And so I'm just wondering whether you had any views about the kind of the genealogy, where Binkley clearly had a very, very strong attachment to questions of mensurability. I mean, you've said as much, and it's clear from the recordings. Ruland, I'm not quite so clear about the passion there. I think for Ruland, it's probably just it's something that is automatic, that comes from the Germanic tradition that I trace back to someone like Friedrich Genry, for example, from kind of 40 years earlier. So that's the thing that came through mostly to me is where is this actually coming from for both of them?
I wouldn't claim, because I didn't see anything that Ruland wrote about this, so maybe Thomas has some ideas on it. For Binkley, it seems to have evolved quite naturally, and he said it extremely confidently. It's on like page 3 of his mammoth article, where he says there are 7 principles to working with monophonic secular song in the Middle Ages. Here they are, and like point 1 is it's inherently rhythmic. And point 2 is it's inherently accompanied by instruments.
But that's assertion. It's not actually.
He has not, as far as I could read, remember a single footnote in this article. What he's doing is he's doing it from experience. I mean, what I would have loved is to have another hour with you guys, because I did all of the pre-recording history. What was Binkley listening to? And what was he recording when he was in school before he came to Europe? And actually, there are some quite magical things out on YouTube. If anybody's interested, I'll give you a whole bunch of references. But he had quite a fantastic education at the University of Illinois with George Hunter, who was apparently not a medieval specialist, but because he had a small group of students who were really interested, including Tom Binkley, Sterling Jones, founding member of the Studio der Frühen Musik, and Anita Noormans, who went on to become one of the great singers of the generation, who didn't end up in the Studio der Frühen Musik, that was Andrea von Ram, but they made this magical constellation, and they recorded an LP of Machot, which is quite beautiful. But from everything else, he describes in his article that he went on tour. He went to India. And he worked, he didn't just play there, he wanted to meet the musicians, and they did jam sessions. He went to Morocco, he went to Spain, and he was trying to play with people. And so this was it was an ingrained belief of his, after having played with people from different areas, that there are basic principles to the way you approach monophonic song. It doesn't matter where you are. We can completely disagree with this. But he underpinned this with ethnomusicological studies that he had done himself in his work. His parents, his father was also in fields of ethno studies. So there was kind of a cultural background that led him toward this direction. And then he was also in contact with the New York Promusica. I don't know much more than that, because he doesn't say, I learned it here. It's this experience that he gained that led him to this artistic vision and personal statement.
The question was about where Konrad Ruland.
This is, yeah.
And I think Georg Jades, the Munich School of Musicology, would be the place to look for more.
I don't think so, because Georgios was not so closely linked to medieval music. I think it's because Ruland came from he came from Mansroll music. He always was used to give music a certain rhythmic structure. And of course, he was not good in foreign languages, so his language was German, and you know what German does with, accents, yeah. And he always followed this Germanic language feeling, also in Latin text and in everything else. So for that reason, we have always a very clear rhythmic decision in his music. I remember this from all the rehearsals we had.
This was the first thing that Ruland did in this style. His previous things had been Janequin and other 15th, 16th century things. He did a bit of De Vitri and Cicconia around the same time, but he was also still in this thing doing Gabrielli and Monteverdi. So there wasn't this focus on how do we do this. I think I completely see what you're saying there.
I'm afraid I have to interrupt here this interesting discussion. First, I would like to thank again Kelly for this inspiring paper. And second, I would like to invite you for coffee break. It's outside, turning to the right. You will smell the coffee, and we will meet here at 4 o'clock sharp. Thank you.
No, Moment, funktioniert nichts. Ah, wirklich? Ah ja, aber die Leute sind lauter. Ja, super. Jemand hat einen Stick? Das ist für Marina. Nein. Ja, vielleicht. Fragen wir. Ja.
Wir würden gerne weitermachen. We would like to continue. Agnese? Es ist an. Agnese? Mit Namen, genau. We are going on with the second part of this afternoon. May I ask for your attention, please? Thank you. We'll have a break afterwards, and you can continue talking. I would like to introduce Christelle Cazaux for the next paper on the Codex Buranus, what it is and how it was made, all we want to know about. Christelle Cazaux is, again, a dear colleague of mine here at the Schola. She studied musicology, medieval and modern history, and Hilfswissenschaften, auxiliary science of history in Paris at the École nationale des Chartes, l'Université de Sorbonne, and the École pratique des hautes études. She graduated first as an archivist paleographe and wrote then a thesis on the French court of King François I. Then, in 2006, she completed her doctorate in medieval musicology with a PhD on the palimpsest of Turin, one of the oldest named graduates and antiquaries in northern Italy. Then, for 8 years, between 2000 and 2008, she was curator at the Performing Arts Department of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, of course. Then she switched to the Université de Poitiers, where she taught music paleography. No, sorry. First, I think.
Students.
Too complicated. First, sorry, I have to read really what I have written down here. 2007 to 2015, she taught music paleography at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris. And from 2008 to 2017, she was assistant professor in Poitiers. So, since then, she is here at the Schola as a, you call it a senior research fellow. That means she is a colleague in the research department here and is also be a teacher for music history and several other things, and a very, very helpful for our microfilm archives and If you have any problems to get manuscripts or complicated prints, she is still the best address to get it. So, and most important, she organized and got the scholarship for this wonderful SNF project on the Codex Buranus and the Carmina Burana Online. And now we will hear the title I have read at the early beginning of my stupid talking. Please.
Thank you, Martin. So if you want, you can download a small handout which will help following the structure of the Codex Buranus, which is quite complicated. Is it okay? Do you reach the QR code? You can also follow without the handout on the screen. It will be a bit small, maybe. Yeah. So, can I start? Yeah. So, in our modern understanding, a book is a bound book. But this was far from always the case in the Middle Ages. Manuscripts could be compiled, owned, and circulated without binding. If they were meant to be preserved over time, they were bound together at some point and given some sort of cover. When the binding wore out, it was taken apart and replaced, or not, if the manuscript was no longer considered useful. With a bit or even a great deal of chance, a manuscript that had remained unused for a long time could escape destruction or repurposing. It could eventually draw attention again and receive a new binding. This is perhaps what happened to the Codex Buranus. Its current binding from the 17th or 18th century was made in Benediktbeuern, the place where it had been preserved for an unknown period of time, and where it was eventually discovered. In this later binding, the choirs are arranged in a sequence that deviates from the original order, resulting in internal inconsistencies. The correct sequence cannot be reconstructed with absolute certainty, as the manuscript has undergone numerous losses over time. You should have this on your handout. This diagram shows a possible sequence of the surviving parts of the original compilation. I'm showing here the first part of the volume, the song part, up to folio 98 verso. The choir colors indicate the main thematic divisions. On the left, you can see the surviving meaningful rubrics. Important evidence on this aspect may have been lost. At least 6 to 9 choirs are missing, maybe more. You can look at the indications of lacuna. The letters S indicate the various scribes. Additional hands are marked with an asterisk. The letters N refer to the hands of the musical notation. On this point, we are not very sure about our classification. It is really provisory, so don't take it seriously. This arrangement is largely based on Wilhelm Mayer's reconstruction, which Otto Schumann adopted in his critical edition, with only minor modifications. Bernard Bischof's introduction to the facsimile edition, together with the descriptions found in the catalogues, further informs this diagram. In light of this, and after an intensive engagement with the manuscript within the Carmina Burana Online project, it seems to us, I'm not alone, we are 2 paleographers actually in the team. Laura is a paleographer, and we looked at the hands. So it seems that some long accepted views need to be revised. And first and foremost, the text hands. I won't go too much into the details, but this concerns in particular the first scribe, known as H1 in the critical edition, Heinz. In fact, there are 9 different hands behind what Schumann found to be H1, and this significantly changes the way we understand the compilation. It has been suggested, for example, that H1 and H2 are respectively a master and a pupil, the former checking and correcting, the latter's copying. While an extraordinary number of corrections were made to the texts, especially to the awkward writing of H2, S2 in our nomenclature, it is very unlikely that any of the correcting hands is H1 or S1, since this hand disappears altogether after the fifth square. None of the later corrections correspond to its script. The differences are rather subtle. All the scribes write in a late Caroline script, barely tinged with Gothic features. With the exception of a few hands that show traces of documentary script, their style is remarkably homogeneous and rather conservative if we accept the usual datation of the codex between 1220 and 1230. On the top left of each of the following slides, I have placed each time a sample of the true hand S1 or H1 to show the contrast. Here you have two additional hands marked with an asterisk that could be a bit later, probably. And they correspond to additions in the manuscript. The hand of the bottom left here is closer to a documentary script than the other. You can see the letters, the hasps of the letters. This is the hand of the Ordo Prophetarum, CB 227, in a choir added just after the main psalm collection. It was generally assumed that it was H1, but actually there are many differences in the way the letters are formed. Let's go back to the diagram. A second issue concerns the isolated folio 49, whose original location is difficult to tell. The folio and one of the fragments found in the late 19th century by Meyer, fragment number 1, probably belong to the same choir. These two leaves, however, do not form a single bifolium, but they share identical pricking marks for the vertical ruling at their lower edge. I put now fragment 1 verso on the other fragment. So. Fragment number 1 escaped the last trimming, since it is not part of the current binding. That's why the pricking marks are still partly visible today on the outer edge. They match the 20-line pattern of the rest of the manuscript. This square might have been located at the end of a section or at the end of the volume, with some leaves left blank, hence the later additions on fragment 1. The third aspect that needs to be revised is the traditional thematic division introduced by Schmeller, the first editor of the Carmina Burana. He divided the collection into 3 main sections: seria, serious, amatoria, love, and potatoria et lusoria, drinking, gambling. Unaware of the correct choir order at that time, Schmeller proposed a classification that simply does not reflect the manuscript's reality. But even after Meyer and Schumann's reconstructions, this division continued to be adopted in editions and studies. The amatoria section, for example, which encompasses all of this, seems particularly problematic. Let us take a closer look at what the manuscript actually reveals about this. After the initial group of Carmina seria, a new section begins on folio 18 verso with the rubric Incipit Jubili. Jubili does not necessarily refer to love songs. And indeed, the pieces under the rubric deal with joyful themes in general. Love is present, but not always, and not always as central theme. The Jubilee sections consist of 3 choirs. There is at least 1 choir missing at its end. As a consequence, we may have lost a subsequent rubric announcing a new section that is called that I labeled Planctus. This one, yeah. And where the songs adopt a plaintive tone, but they are not all about love either. The term amatoria, if we want to keep it, would be better applied to the following section, this one, which contains poems about animals, spring, and love, of course, and most of them are mixing Latin with Middle High German. Finally, there is a section commonly referred to as drinking and gambling songs. Again, the denomination is somewhat problematic because this part is by no means a straightforward invitation to debauchery in the taverns. Several metrical poems counterbalance the song's hint of excess with statements that set clear boundaries to human behavior. The end of this section is put into the mouth of the so-called Goliaths, or clerici vagantes. These Latin poets and songmakers are here as if they took responsibility for this section and for the song compilation as a whole. Following the song part of the manuscript, there is a last section with a group of plays and religious additions. The flyleaves of the fragmenta 2 to 7, now preserved separately, were once part of the bound book. Choir numbered 17 includes 2 plays, one of the prophets and one of the king of Egypt and Babylon. This choir had the same ruling pattern and justification width as the main part of the manuscript, but is written by a new hand that does not appear anywhere else in the surviving parts. The neumes, too, are clearly not the work of any of the neume scribes who intervened elsewhere. With its protagonist discussing the plausibility of a sinless birth of Jesus Christ, the play stages a kind of debate that could well have taken place in a church school as a Christmas season entertainment. This scholarly spirit, tinged with parody, is already very much present in the song part. This is one of the possible reasons why this choir, whether produced separately or as a complement to the rest, has found its place here. The rest of this last section only seems to move away from what precedes. There is a final choir with a Latin-German passion play, followed by an Emmaus play. The fragmenta highlighted in green contain liturgical plays. Let us also note that the Emmaus play and the Easter play are labeled exemplar in the rubrics, as if they were some kind of model or sample. This complete set of choirs, including the fragmenta, was bound together at some point, probably in the Middle Ages already. On the left, you can see the spine of the book as we know it today, with the current sewing clearly visible in the choir folds. But there are traces of 9 other holes, which appear exactly in the same positions in the fragmenta, which led Meyer to consider that they were part of the Codex Buranus. Yet Meyer didn't provide a pattern of these holes. So they form actually 2 sets of respectively 4 and 5 holes. Look at the black and the blue arrows. Sorry, too quick. I interpret this as a possible evidence of 2 earlier bindings campaigns. At particular moments of history, however, the manuscript may have been left as loose gatherings. Indeed, the outer leaves of almost all the choirs are darkened and soiled, and in many places the ink has been rubbed away. Bound or unbound, the manuscript was extensively used. Traces of handling appear almost everywhere, and nearly all the outer edges are darkened from repeated leafing. Supposing that it was originally commissioned by a prince, bishop, or another middle to high rank figure interested in a large-scale collection, the manuscript soon lost its initial purpose. It is by no means a luxurious book. Even though it did receive 8 miniatures, they are not luxurious either. At least I think, but let's see what Marina will say about it. And they were probably not part of the original plan. like these two lovers in this position. They're not lying. Where spaces or entire leaves had been left blank, the compilation continued to be enriched until the 14th century, with numerous additional texts, Latin, German, bilingual, both neumes and unneumed. The manuscript apparently remained in the place where its production had begun, probably in a monastery or a church. To understand what kind of book the Codex Buranus was meant to be or has become with time, we must consider its musical notation. I will focus only on a few aspects that reshape how we understand these notations and their function, and more broadly, with what this implies for our perception of medieval songbooks. The critical edition distinguishes 4 or 5 main hands for the song part, N1, N2, A and B. Schumann is not sure if this is the same person or not. N3, N4. You have a sample of each of the hands here. For a long time, this classification has been accepted without discussion. Recently, Davide Daolmi, who is here in this room, has suggested reassigning to N4 all the pieces formerly attributed to N1 in the song part, not in the additional part, as well as one formerly attributed to N2. It seems to me that the main neume hands may involve maybe more individuals than just 3, 4, or 5, but distinguishing them from one another with any certainty could well be doomed to failure. One thing is certain. Apart from N1, as identified by the critical edition, all the numerations were added long after the text had been copied. The codicological evidence is without ambiguity. The song compilation was probably intended to be notated. Entirely not sure. Some pieces show a spacing of the text that anticipates melismas, but other pieces, whether melismatic or syllabic, show no such feature, and we cannot tell. In any case, notation was not applied systematically, even where it had been clearly planned. Eventually, only 52 items. So it's very complicated to count the things in the Codex Buranus. So you will hear many figures. Yeah, don't trust too much, but roughly 52 items have been notated, of which 40 belong to the song part and 12 to the additional materials. N1's interventions are all marked by red strokes placed beneath the melismas, whether space was provided for them or not, like here in Vacillantis Trutine or Dulce Solum. This manner of setting out the text and the musical notation is entirely consistent with liturgical manuscript of the time, especially in German regions. Here you have a sample of German liturgical manuscript, South German mainly. Interlinear spacing is tight, even when notation was planned. Horizontal space is more or less provided for the melisma, when there are melismas. Red strokes delimit the melismas. Notation runs from the beginning to the end of the text for most of the chant pieces, since they are usually not strophic. The last manuscript coming a bit more in the north, Rhineland. The song part of the Codex Buranus contains mainly strophic or sequence-like pieces. They are always written from beginning to end, like in chant manuscripts, even when all the strophes have the same melody, which means that the same melody will be written multiple times, like here with Dulce Solum on the left. Other Latin song collections, such as the later Cambridge songs on the right, or vernacular chansonniers, usually give the melody only for the first stanza of a strophic piece, and the remaining text is placed as a block after this first stanza. N1 is the only neume scribe who added notation in the normal sequence of manuscript production, after the text, but before the rubrication and the initials. We can see here the initial V overlapping the neumes in Vacillantis Trutine. You can see a portion of neume. And likewise, the O passing over the neumes in O curas homine, the first virga. maybe you cannot see from where you are. Sorry. On this slide, this is another Neum scribe, N2, and there are many differences. There are no red strokes beneath the Neums. Instead, the red strokes were placed on the text line by the rubricator. In the absence of Neums, the notation was added later. How can I know that? Likewise, several other hands added Neums after the rubrication and after the Lombard initials had been executed. The Neums were fitted around the initials whenever possible, or written over them when no other space was available. Here you can clearly see the Neums overlapping the initials, so they were made after. How much later did this numation occur compared to those by N1? A relative chronology can be established by considering the letters of expectation and the initials themselves. I see three main types of initials in the song part of the Codex Buranus, but I am not an art historian. You will hear more about it after. The filigree initials on the left, type 1, were probably made very soon after the copy. Indications, incipits of the pieces, were written in the outer margins of the folios, some of them still visible today. They are circled in green. The second type of initials appears to belong to a later campaign. And the third type could belong to an even later one. These initials have their own series of letters of expectation, here, circled in blue. They were obviously added after the original margin indication had been trimmed a first time, for a first binding, maybe. And they were no more visible or no more fully legible at the time these new initials were made, these final initials were made. This new series of letters show a Gothic cursive script, and likely to date before the final decades of the 13th century, or even the 14th century, according to paleographers. The Neums are therefore at least as late as the Lombard initials themselves, closer to the 14th century, maybe, than to the 12th century, or than to 1230, sorry. The same Gothic cursive hand added an abbreviation for nota next to 8 songtext. Schumann saw them, but didn't explain anything about them. And I wonder if this is an indication that musical notation should be added to these pieces. But why these pieces and no others, not others? Was their melody already known, or were there a written model at hand where the Codex Buranus was made and kept? I'm fine. Of course, nota can have several meanings, not necessarily a musical one, but it is a long-standing term to designate a musical pitch and the written sign associated to it that can be found in music treatises. Thank you. And the verb notare means to note or to notate. All in all, 40 of the 52 texts in the main part of the Codex Buranus received Neums only decades after the text had been copied. That's very little, considering the more than 200 rhythmic pieces contained in the manuscript. We do not know whether all of these rhythmi actually had identified circulating melodies. Half of these pieces are unique to the Codex Buranus. Only 43 can be found with notated melodies in parallel sources. Do these late notations reflect an effort to complete a book that was originally intended to be neumed as much as possible just for record? Or did they serve a more practical purpose? These often awkward numations show no calligraphic quality at all, something which is highly unusual for a regular music book. Their empirical character is typical of the later additions, marginalia, that we find at the end of so many liturgical or non-liturgical books. Spontaneous, yes, but not careless. All of these ends tend to correct themselves during the process of writing. At times, they correct the text too, as you can see here. Despite the thicker quill, this seems to be the same hand on both extracts, as the correction of the text suggests. This song, Veris dulcis in tempore, is copied twice in the Codex Buranus. Once without music in the Jubili section, and once with notation throughout under the rubric Devere, spring. The same melody is written 4 times in the 4 stanzas. The groups of neumes that I've circled correspond to melodically identical passages, which the scribe corrects several times. The short passage circled in blue causes the scribe some trouble at first, but later he manages to write it correctly. The passage with the repeated virgae circled in green remains problematic throughout. It is difficult to know why the scribe shortens his virgae and what exactly he intends by it musically. This kind of notation is a work in progress made visible to us. We cannot claim that these neumes had no idea what they were doing. They are hesitant, but they undoubtedly try to be faithful to something. Were these scribes relying on their memory or on performance in situations or on dictation by someone who knew the melody? Or did they have written models, but with a different kind of notation maybe, that needed to be translated into neume notation? Writing neumes, staffless neumes, is in the late 13th or early 14th century is not necessarily a sign of backwardness. It is simply what this kind of tight manuscript layout allows to do. There is no room for staves. In the graduale on the left, selected chant melodies are written with staff notation at their opening. But then the scribes turn back to neume notation. It's original, it was not scraped and rewritten. Neumes serve as an extraordinary mnemonic aid when a melody is already known. If neume were still used at that time, does it mean that there was a strong oral tradition with Latin and German song, like in chant repertoire, for example? Or did the clerics, poets, performers try something else than just write down known melodies? Set. I will say no more. I am coming to my conclusion. The Codex Buranus is the first compilation of song texts, though not only song text, and one of the major collections of plays and substantial volume that has come down to us. Even if its content is predominantly secular, it clearly arises from Latin clerical culture, while creating a link with the vernacular one. In terms of scale and chronology, one is naturally tempted to compare it with the large vernacular songbooks that begin to be produced at this time. Most of these chansonniers from the 13th and early 14th century, however, appear to be collectors' books rather than books intended for use, though not all of them. For example, the Chansonnier of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Français 20,050, at the BNF in Paris, is chronologically very close to the Codex Buranus, perhaps as early as the 1230s, according to Robert Luke. Like the Codex Buranus, it is unfinished, partially notated, partly completed over time, and not luxurious either. Yet, contrary to this chansonnier, which seems to have been expanded in a rather empirical manner, the contents of the Codex Buranus appears to have been remarkably conceived and organized into thematic sections, probably from the outset. This implies a commissioner, or at least someone who had planned matters to some extent, and an effort to gather the materials needed for copying the text and perhaps also the melodies. But those responsible for the making of the book ended up keeping it and completing it for their own use. For about a century, it may well have served for a practical purpose: teaching, learning, performing Latin and German songs, as well as plays within a church milieu, maybe a school. The Codex Buranus has miraculously escaped the fate of most utilitarian manuscripts in the Middle Ages: disappearance through wear or war, obsolescence, loss of interest, recycling into later bindings, or decay. despite its corrupted texts, awkward ends, and barely decipherable neumes, it is a fascinating source. But I'm not sure that it is the kind of book a 13th century bishop or imperial protonotarius would have dreamt of. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christelle. It was a kind of deconstruction of the manuscript and the content and of the technical advices of today. Any comments, questions, remarks? Kelly.
Thank you, Christelle. Very lovely. I've got a question about the ludus. You mentioned exemplum, exemplar. Could you just give us a little idea of what you think this refers to in the context of a school, maybe?
Sorry?
School context, even? Or?
Yeah.
Schola?
I have the strong impression that this is a book for some church school, because it makes sense. It's the logic, the entire logic, also the logic of the additions in respect to the content of the songbook, which is quite a secular repertoire, different. It makes sense. And I don't know exactly, to answer your question, it has been already commented by scholars. It's not my finding, but exemplum, apparitionis, exemplum, is it also a school exercise, maybe? I wonder. Because also all these plays are unfinished. And they are not as they are provided with new very largely, so not just as a literary exercise. The music is conceived with it, is part of the process, but they are not in a state that can be represented directly. They need some, and since they have no other concordances in other sources, we are left with just that. But I don't know. Maybe someone in the room knows it, but I have no idea of other rubrics describing a liturgical play as an exemplum. When they are conserved in liturgical manuscripts, they are just a play, and maybe there is no rubric at all. So these two ones are like that.
A lazy school. Mark.
Thank you very much. So you have concluded that this manuscript was used a lot in the Middle Ages. What for? What do you think? Because we have now seen that it maybe wasn't used for a lot of things we might consider it for, but what do you think it was used for?
If we assume that it is a book meant for learning Latin through poetry and performing, because in the Middle Ages you don't read silently, you read aloud. Even at that time. We have traces of silent reading, but not for this kind of repertoire. This is rhythmic poetry, this is sounding, as Guido said. You have the melody of the text, and you have above that the melody of the music, if you had a real melody. So I could imagine that it was used, yes, for learning repertoire, for learning ideas. It has also, in its conception, in its thematic division, it has a kind of didactic flavor. It's also a way of transmitting ideas on life, on church, on what is good, what is bad, what man should do, what is love. And all this was also learned in monasteries. So the monks were the first one who made love songs, actually, in the Middle Ages and far before that time. And we have many other repertoires. We don't know if they were always sung or well. So I think it was used extensively, and probably until at some point in the 14th century, maybe it was regarded as obsolete, and then who knows? but this is very interesting because also we can read in the scholarly literature that the book was immaculate, no traces of use. But for a long time, people used a facsimile by Bernard Bischoff, and the photographies were completely reworked, and the manuscript looks clean in the facsimile, almost clean in the facsimile. Whereas when you look at the digital images that are now available online, even if we can consider that it was soiled by being just left aside for a long time and not cared about, I think there's a leafing, it's visible, it is all kinds, so it was used. So they should have some interest for this poetry as an exercise.
And then when it wasn't used anymore, that's when the neumes came in? Or?
No. I think it was used. The neumes are an evidence that it was used and used late. And we have other traces, I guess Mark Everett could say a lot about this, but we have other traces of late manuscripts transmitting still the conductus repertoire notated at late stages, especially in German region, by the way. So the fact that it has neumes is just because, they couldn't write the staves here, obviously. And we find neumes in the 14th century, also staffless in liturgical manuscript, in addition, especially. So, no, I think it's an evidence, really, that it was used maybe for singing or for trying to make something with the text. But Mathieu had other ideas on that.
Mark?
Thank you, Christelle. French is banned, isn't it, in this conference? I can't hear that. So I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in English.
My English is bad,
which is kind of weird, right? Thank you. That was really very, very interesting. What I liked about your paper is the fact that you brought this kind of head-banging codicology and paleography to us from one side, and then at the end these larger questions about how the book was put together, and I very much liked the opposition you drew between a book like the Codex Buranus and the big Trouvères chansonniers, which, whether they're collector's items or whatever they are, but I was thinking about other Latin song and poetry collections, of which there are a lot which are not collections in that sense. You know, they're not sort of art objects in the same way as the Trouvères manuscripts are. But this is particularly interesting because the Codex Buranus has got an ordinatio, right? I mean, it's really quite carefully planned. From everything you showed us, associated with the codicology and the paleography, it's quite clear that there's some kind of ordinatio behind it. It's not entirely clear what that is, but it's quite clear that it's there. And of course, this does characterize the Trouvères chansonniers as well, even the Chansonnier Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which has got a level of organization to it. But like the Codex Buranus, it's got all these later editions. I'm trying to formulate this into a question that I can actually ask you. I suppose the one that really sat at the back of my mind was that among all the other collections of unnotated, partially notated, and fully notated Latin songbooks from, let's say, 1230 to 1330, where does the Codex Buranus sit in terms of its levels of planning, its levels of organization, its levels of, you know, a kind of reflective ordinatio which underpins the structure of the book?
I have the impression that it is especially ordinated. It has its ordinatio, this especially is planned, but still we have lost many choirs, so maybe if we had the entire collection we would not say that anymore. And I must also confess that I don't know well enough the other collections of Latin. If we think to the Beckington A44 in Oxford, it's purely textual. There is no music, but there are so many concordances with the conductus and with Latin rhythmic poetry that we find notated elsewhere, that it is very important to musicologists. But I must confess that this manuscript has rubrics too, which are very interesting at times. I have the feeling that it was already also carefully planned. But for example, if you take the later Cambridge songs, it's just a kind of libellus. It's a manuscript utilitarian, also not at all luxurious or collectors, so many problems with the notation, but it doesn't seem to be planned in terms of organization of its content. So I think the Codex Buranus is probably a bit an exception. Of course, it's easy to see it as an exception when you work on it, but yeah, and that's also, yeah.
It offers one paradigm among many possible ones.
Yeah.
Sorry, it offers one paradigm among many others, and actually is for me is providing a springboard for different ways of thinking about the entire corpus of Latin song manuscripts, you know, in the century and a half after 1200, which is kind of great, really.
Yeah, I think the paradigm is literary. It's really the content. This may be the main difference with other chansonniers or songbooks.
We won't solve the question now. Thank you again, Christelle.
Thank you.
I would like to ask Bernasconi. Ich begrüße herzlich Marina Bernasconi. Sie wird auf Deutsch reden, weil sie als gute Schweizerin das lernen musste und das jetzt auch endlich auch anwenden muss. Es ist ein leuchtendes Vorbild für alle Scholaren. Lernt auch Deutsch. Sie ist Kunsthistorikerin und hat sich vor allen Dingen auf die Miniaturen konzentriert, hat dort studiert, in Florenz und auch eine Arbeit darüber geschrieben, 1983. Sie hat einen Abschluss an der Vatikanischen Schule für Paläographie, Diplomatik und ich habe leider den französischen Titel hier, das muss ich lieber vorlesen. École Vaticane de Paléographie, de Diplomatique et d'Archiviste, heißt wahrscheinlich auf Italienisch ähnlich, 1985 und hat dann in Fribourg in der Schweiz ein Doktorat en Lettres gemacht. Sie ist sehr beteiligt, war lange beteiligt zwischen 2008 und 2020 an etwas, was wir häufig nutzen, nämlich eCodices, diese wunderbare Plattform, wo Handschriften in der Schweiz zugänglich gemacht werden. Nicht nur mittelalterliche, sondern auch andere. Sie ist auch bei dieser Plattform Fragmentarium beteiligt, auch eine interessante Sammlung und verbunden mit der Universitätsbibliothek in Lausanne. Und sie ist verantwortlich für das Curatorium pour le catalogue des manuscrits médiévaux et prémodernes conservés en Suisse, wie auch das Problem Ticinensia, wo eben diese Fragmente von Manuskripten aus dem Mittelalter hier gesammelt werden. Viele Publikationen in dem Bereich, auch zu mittelalterlichen Inschriften und Pergamentmanuskripten mit Illuminationen, also Buchschmuck etc. Und also Bezug vor allen Dingen auf den Kanton Tessin. Sie kommt selber aus Lausanne und wir sind interessiert jetzt an dieser kunsthistorischen Perspektive. Der Buchschmuck eines Codex CLM 4660 mit den Carmina Burana. Und was machen wir mit diesen merkwürdigen Miniaturen, obwohl ich noch anmerken möchte, Christelle, liegende Liebhaber finde ich jetzt nicht. Woher weißt du das? Woher weißt du das? Aber das diskutieren wir später. Entschuldigung, Marina Bernasconi.
Danke. Also zunächst möchte ich den Organisatorinnen dafür danken, dass sie mich zu dieser Tagung, die dieser bedeutenden Anschriften gewidmet ist, eingeladen und mir ihre umfangreiche Bibliografie zur Verfügung gestellt haben. Ich muss gestehen, dass ich ohne zu zögern zugesagt habe, als Laura Albiero mich kontaktiert hat und gefragt, ob ich bereit wäre, einen Vortrag über die Buchmalerei dieser Handschrift zu halten. Ich hatte natürlich schon von dieser Handschrift gehört und die Miniaturen gesehen, aber ich hatte ihn deutlich unterschätzt. Paläographen, Philologen, Musikwissenschaftler und Buchmalereispezialisten haben sich mit dieser ikonischen Handschrift beschäftigt. Viel wurde gesagt und viel kann noch gesagt werden. Von meiner Seite, ich werde mich auf den Buchschmuck konzentrieren. Nicht nur auf die Bildausstattung, sondern auch auf den sekundären Buchschmuck, das heißt Initialen, um zu versuchen, die verschiedenen Phasen der Ausführung, die Arbeitsweise der verschiedenen Schreiber und ihre möglichen Inspirationsquellen zu rekonstruieren. Zunächst werde ich die verschiedenen Phasen der Erstellung einer illuminierten Handschrift zusammenfassen. Ich habe hier ein Bild der berühmten Miniatur aus dem Codex Patristicum 5 aus Bamberg, aus dem Kloster Michelsberg aus der Mitte des 12. Jahrhunderts ausgewählt. Auch wenn die Kunst der Buchmalerei im Laufe der Jahrhunderte bedeutende stilistische Veränderungen erfahren hat, so haben sich die verschiedenen Phasen ihrer Herstellung nicht wesentlich verändert. Nachdem das Pergament vorbereitet und in Blätter der gewünschten Größe und Menge geschnitten worden war, wurden diese gefalzt und zu Lagen ineinandergelegt. Nun zog man Linien in unserer Handschrift mit Tinte, mit denen man auf jener Seite die Fläche definierte, in der der Text stehen sollte. Gleichzeitig zum Beispiel oder ganzseitig oder zweispaltig mit musikalen Noten oder mit Kommentar zum Beispiel noch. Normalerweise wurden alle Seiten der Lage liniert, unabhängig davon, ob sie ganzseitige Miniaturen enthalten sollten oder nicht. An diesem Punkt konnte mit der Transkription des Textes begonnen werden, die nach einem Exemplar kopiert wurden, das dem Schreiber zur Verfügung stand, zum Beispiel von Mutterkloster im Falle neuer Gründungen, als Leihgabe von anderen Institutionen. Oder ist auch denkbar, dass sie nach Diktat geschrieben oder nach einer mündlichen Version schriftlich festgehalten wurde. Beim Kopieren wurden zuerst jene Teile abgeschrieben, die in Schwarz erscheinen sollten. Am Ende jeder Lage fügte der Kopist einen Reklamanten hinzu oder eine Lagenzählung, um dem Buchbinder die richtige Reihenfolge anzugeben. Nachdem der Kopist den Text fertiggestellt hatte, begann er von vorne, um die Teile in Rot, die Titel, Überschriften, die Initialen, alles, was man jetzt Rubrizierung nennt, einzufügen und vervollständigte dann, falls erforderlich, mit den anderen Farben, zum Beispiel die blaue Tinte. Er hatte freigelassene Flächen für Initialen und Rubriken vorgesehen und sorgte dafür, dass der Text der Rubrik in abgekürzter Form am Rand vermerkt wurde, wo er auch kleine Buchstaben als Hinweise für die Initialen notierte, die sogenannten Repräsentanten. Ein spezielles Feld wurde für den Fall vorgesehen, dass Bildseiten, Streifenbilder, Kleinbilder und so weiter geplant waren. Das ikonografische Programm der liturgischen Handschriften war seit Jahrhunderten kodifiziert und erforderte daher selten Anweisungen. Im Gegenteil, bei Handschriften in volkssprachlichen Literatur, epischen oder mythologischen Erzählungen, wissenschaftlichen oder anderen Werken, deren Ikonografie und Position im Text noch nicht standardisiert waren, finden sich hingegen häufig Anweisungen zum darzustellenden Thema. Diese sind leider oft unter den Bildern oder durch den Beschneiden verschwunden. Die Notation, sofern vorgesehen, wird am Ende von den Schreibern des Textes oder von einem Spezialisten aus diesem Gebiet hinzugefügt. Der dafür vorgesehene Platz wurde durch Vergrößerungen des Zeilenabstands berechnet. Die Anfertigung der Miniaturen erfolgt vor dem letzten Arbeitsschnitt, dem Einbinden. Der Buchmaler arbeitet also wie der Schreiber an noch ungebundenen Blättern. Aber zurück zum Codex Buranus. Die Handschrift enthält weder Reklamanten noch irgendeine Art von Nummerierung der Lagen. Es ist schwer zu sagen, ob dies beabsichtigt ist oder ob diese Hinweise beim Binden verloren gegangen sind. Dies beraubt uns jedoch eines wichtigen Elements, um die ursprüngliche Reihenfolge der Lagen festzustellen. Wir können uns eine Handschrift vorstellen, die nicht als Einheit konzipiert war, sondern nach und nach aus einzelnen Lagen entstand, die erst später zusammengefügt wurden. In diesem Zusammenhang ist anzumerken, dass am oberen Rand von Folio 107 recto die Invokationsformel Sancta Maria Virgo assit nostro principio, Amen, zu lesen ist, die normalerweise auf der ersten Seite von Handschriften zu finden ist. Wahrscheinlich zirkulierte diese Lage Nummer 18, die eine andere Zeilenzahl hat, 27 gegenüber die 22 im Hauptteil der Handschrift, getrennt und wurde erst später mit den anderen zusammengefügt. Außerdem ist die Schrift auf Folie 106 Verso sehr verblasst, was daran hindeutet, dass es vielleicht eine Zeit lang das letzte Blatt einer Reihe Vorlagen war, die ohne Einband zirkulierten. Um die Teile mit roter Tinte zu schreiben, folgte der Schreiber den Anweisungen am Rand. Der größte Teil davon ist beim Beschneiden verschwunden, aber einige sind noch am äußeren Rand zu erkennen. Vor allem neben den Texten, die vom Schreiber 1, jetzt muss ich sagen, ich hatte noch nicht den Vortrag von Esther gehört, bei mir ist noch Schreiber 1 und Schreiber 2, also die Hauptschreiber. Also vor allem neben den Texten, die vom Schreiber 1 geschrieben wurden. Auf Folio 26 recto befindet sich die Angabe für das erste Wort in der oberen Außenecke und enthält den Text a globo, während der Schreiber der Angabe für die Initialen folgte und ein E geschrieben hat. Auf Folio 17 recto ein ähnliches Beispiel. R ist falsch und wurde dann korrigiert. Ich habe keine Textvorgabe für die Textanfänge in dem von Kopisten 2 geschriebenen Teil gefunden, wo hingegen häufig der Hinweis für Refrain zu finden ist. Vielleicht ein für den Schreiber ungewöhnlicher Begriff, weil diese Abkürzung ist sehr selten, der vermerkt werden musste. Vorgabe für die Initialen hingegen sind in der gesamten Handschrift vorhanden. In der Regel in der Nähe der Anfangsbuchstabens, relativ groß und in Minuskel geschrieben. Nur in einem Fall wurde die Initiale nicht ausgeführt, auf Folio 29 recto, genau dort, wo der Schreiber 2 die Arbeit von Schreiber 1 übernimmt, wenn wir auf diese Trennung bleiben. Die Satzmajuskel und Versalien sind, abgesehen von einigen Stellen, in der Regel rot geschrieben und in einigen Teilen des Textes von Schreiber 2 in grün, zum Beispiel Folio 39 bis 31. Verschwunden. Ja. Mhm. Ich glaube, ich muss diese benutzen. Ja. Oder diese grüne Satzmajuskel oder dem gesamten CB 156, aber jedoch ohne eine klare Logik. Die Verwendung der Farbe Grün ist seltener, aber nicht ungewöhnlich. Ein ähnliches Beispiel findet sich zum Beispiel in einer in Neustift aufbewahrten Anschrift unbekannter Herkunft aus der zweiten Hälfte des 12. Jahrhunderts oder in diese Anschrift aus Basel, die abwechselnd rote und grüne Initialen mit Für und E aufweisen. Das erste Wort der verschiedenen Texte ist in Kapital- und Unzialschrift geschrieben, in Schwarz mit roten Strichelungen oder abwechselnd Rot und Schwarz. In einigen Fällen ist deutlich zu erkennen, dass zuerst die schwarzen Buchstaben geschrieben wurden, wobei der Platz für die roten Buchstaben, die später hinzugefügt wurden, nicht immer ausreichte. Zum Beispiel hier in der Mitte. Kommen wir nun zu den größeren Initialen, das heißt die vorangestellt durch einen Zeilenumbruch, die wichtige Funktion haben, den Beginn eines Textes zu markieren und die Orientierung auf der Seite zu erleichtern. Sie sind oft die einzige Verzierung in den Anschriften und gehören in der Regel zum Aufgabenbereich der Kopisten. Für die Initialen wurde in dieser Anschrift in der Regel ein Platz von 2 bis 3 Textzeilen freigelassen, der nicht von der Form des Buchstabens abhängt, außer beim P, wo der Schreiber in einigen Fällen 2 Zeilen für den Bogen zurückgesetzt hat und 3 weitere für den senkrechten Schaft vorgesehen hat. Diese Abstände werden von denjenigen, die die Initialen angefertigt haben, nicht immer eingehalten, wie hier. Es gibt verschiedene Arten von Initialen. Einfache rote Lombarden. Ich habe hier nur eine repräsentative Auswahl gemacht. Außerdem ich habe grün für den Kopist 1 und violett für den Kopist 2. Sie befinden sich sowohl in dem vom ersten als auch vom zweiten Kopisten geschriebenen Teilen, sogar die gleiche Form bei den beiden Kopisten. Es gibt dann solche mit einfachen weißen Schaftaussparungen, die überwiegend beim Kopist 2 sind, oder Initialen ohne Schaftaussparungen mit Konturbegleitstriche, Palmetten bzw. Halbpalmetten, die sich sowohl bei Kopist 1 als bei Kopist 2 befinden. Oder mit Schaftaussparungen und Konturbegleitstriche, Palmetten bzw. Halbpalmetten, überwiegend bei Kopist 2. Es gibt auch rote Initialen mit blauen Verzierungen, die nur auf den Folien 3 bis 12 zu finden sind, die vom Schreiber 1 geschrieben wurden. Und schließlich sind Initialen mit eingezeichneten Gesichtern zu erwähnen, bärtig und unbärtig und wie ich hier vorschlage, vielleicht mit einer Tonsur. Diejenigen mit den gestrichelten Linien, wie auf Seite 68 Verso oder 69 Verso. Die Gesichter finden sich im Buchstabeninneren von D, O, P und V. Mit Ausnahme des Buchstabens auf Folio 47 befinden sich alle im vom Schreiber 2 geschriebenen Teil. Sie wurden oft von Wissenschaftlern zitiert, die vermuten, dass es sich möglicherweise um die Gesichter der beiden Schreiber handelt, wobei eins der Ältere und zwei der Jüngere und dessen Schüler ist. Oder sie werden als eine Art verbale Kommunikation interpretiert, um bestimmte Gesänge speziell zu kennzeichnen. Ähnliche Beispiele von Gesichtern in Buchstaben finden sich jedoch auch in anderen Handschriften. Ich zeige euch zwei Beispiele, die ich gefunden habe. Und ich entschuldige mich für die schlechte Qualität der Bilder. Für die zweifarbigen Beispiele bedanke ich mich bei Christelle. Die Ausstattung wird durch farbige Federzeichnungen ergänzt, teilweise koloriert oder auf einem überwiegend blauen Hintergrund. Es handelt sich um 6 Streifenbilder mit jeweils einer Szene, der Rad der Fortuna, der Mann, der einer Frau einen Blumenstrauß überreicht, 4 trinkende Männer, die Würfelspiele, Brettspiel, Schachspiel, sind diese. Oder mit 2 Registern, die mit den Aeneas-Szene. Und außerdem gibt es eine ganzseitige Miniatur. Was ihre Position im Text angeht, kann man festhalten, dass zweifellos eine Art Illustration vorgesehen war, da die Schreiber jeweils Platz freigelassen haben, aber dass zumindest in einem Fall nicht klar war, wie viel Platz man lassen sollte. Und dies wird auf dieser Seite 72 deutlich, wo die Szene horizontal angeordnet wurde. Objektiv betrachtet hätte sie bei vertikaler Anordnung zu viel Platz eingenommen oder hätte sie im Randbereich verschoben werden müssen. Bei vielen Miniaturen gibt es ein Problem mit der Überlappung des Rahmens mit der letzten und ersten Textzeile und der Initiale, insbesondere in dem vom Schreiber 2 transkribierten Textteilen. Die einzige Miniatur mit der doppelten exotischen Landschaft befindet sich auf der Rückseite eines unlinierten Blattes, das eine Lage abschloss. Dies könnte bedeuten, dass auf dieser Rückseite weder Text noch eine Miniatur vorgesehen war. Die Streifenbilder sind von einem breiten grünen Rahmen begrenzt, der wiederum von weiteren dünnen roten Rahmenlinien eingefasst wird. Die Einfügung von Miniaturen in ein System aus 2 Rahmen in 2 verschiedenen Farben ist in der deutschen Miniaturmalerei des 12. Jahrhunderts recht verbreitet. Ebenso wie das Herausragen einiger Elemente aus dem Rahmen oder die Überlagerung des Rahmens durch die Zeichnung, wie es beispielsweise bei Vogel auf Folio 64 oder bei den Füßen der Schachspieler der Fall ist. Wir können das hier als eines unter vielen Beispielen auch in einer anderen Anschrift aus Scheiern sehen. Was die Ikonografie der Miniaturen angeht, es wurde bereits viel darüber geschrieben und ich beschränke mich deshalb auf eine knappe Darstellung. Das Rad der Fortuna. Die Miniatur befand sich ursprünglich nicht am Anfang des Bandes. Sie begleitet die Gedichte 1418, die sich mit der Unbeständigkeit des Schicksals befassen. Das Motiv geht auf Boetius' De Consolatione Philosophiae zurück und findet sich sowohl in Miniaturen als auch zum Beispiel auf Kirchenfassaden wieder, zum Beispiel im Dom von Trient. Ein bekannter Kenner der Buchmalerei hat vermutet, dass es sich bei der zentralen Figur um einen Mann handelt. aber die langen Haare, die hier über die Schultern fallen, weisen sie eindeutig als Frau aus. Nach Ansicht einiger anderer Wissenschaftler könnten die seitlichen Figuren Friedrich II. Und sein Sohn Heinrich VII. Sein. Und es wurden Parallelen zu den Münzen und Siegeln dieses Herrschers gezogen. Das Bild der Natur oder auch Landschaft genannt, ist die einzige ganzseitige Miniatur und ist zweigeteilt. Auf der oberen Ebene sind Bäume und Vögel dargestellt. Auf der unteren sind neben weiteren Bäumen noch Vögel, ein Hase, ein Löwe, ein Hirsch, ein Hund und ein Pferd zu sehen. Zwischen den Zweigen eines Baumes erkennt man ein Gesicht, vielleicht einen wilden Mann. Es gilt als die erste Darstellung einer Landschaft in der mittelalterlichen Kunst. Nach dem Rad der Fortuna ist es zweifellos das bekannteste Bild dieser Anschrift, aber auch das aus interpretatorischer Sicht problematischste. Während in der romanischen Kunst Innenräume oft detailreich dargestellt werden und auf Gegenstände aus dem Umfeld der Miniaturmalers verweisen, unterliegen Landschaftsdarstellungen eher einer Formreduktion und Vereinfachung. Vorlagen sind möglicherweise die Szenen aus der Darstellung des irdischen Paradieses, während einige Pflanzen und Tiere Parallelen in Bestiarien finden, von denen eines als Vorlage gedient haben könnte. Das Liebespaar oder ein Mann, der einer Frau einen Blumenstrauß überreicht. Beide sind nach der Mode des 13. Jahrhunderts gekleidet. Sie tragen eng anliegende Gewänder. Dasjenige des Mannes ist etwas kürzer und werden von einem Gürtel zusammengehalten, der oft als kostbaren Stoff oder Seide oder mit Edelmetall verziert war. Die Ärmel folgen der Form der Arme. Beim Mann ist das Futter zu sehen, möglicherweise besteht es aus Hermelin. Aeneas und Dido, eine zweitgeteilte Miniatur. Oben der Abschied des Aeneas und der Selbstmord von der Dido, unten die Ausfahrt des Aeneas. Wie bereits von anderen Wissenschaftlern erwähnt, entspricht die Bildendreihenfolge nicht der erzählerischen Abfolge, da sich Dido erst nach Aeneas' Abreise das Leben nimmt. Der Zyklus dieser Geschichte wurde wahrscheinlich häufiger dargestellt, als uns heute überliefert ist. Und dem Buchmaler könnte eine Anschrift mit dem vollständigen Zyklus des Aeneis zur Verfügung gestanden haben. Wie zum Beispiel der illustrierte Aeneas-Roman von Heinrich von Weldecke aus dem frühen 13. Jahrhundert belegt, zu dem eine besondere ikonografische Nähe besteht. Übrigens, Sie sehen auch in dieser Berliner Anschrift unten eine Darstellung eines Schachspiels. Und nun kommen wir zu den Szenen mit dem geselligen Zeitvertreib. Die Aufteilung der 4 trinkenden Männer in 2 Paare oben wird durch die unterschiedliche Hintergrundfarbe verdeutlicht. Links gelb und rechts rosa. Nur die Figur auf der linken Seite unterscheidet sich durch einen Mantel, den sie über der Tunika trägt. Die anderen Szenen aber hingegen alle einen blauen Hintergrund. In der ersten Szene wird gewürfelt. Die Darstellung ist sehr schematisch. Die Figuren scheinen im Leeren zu sitzen und seltsamerweise entsprechen den 3 Köpfe der Figuren links nur ein paar Beine. Im Gegensatz dazu sitzen die Spieler in der Miniatur mit dem Backgammon-Spiel auf Hockern mit Kissen. Das Spielbrett ist sehr groß, vielleicht um ein echtes Spiel darzustellen. Rechts taucht die Figur mit einem Stock und einem Becher wieder auf, die bereits im Würfelspiel zu sehen war. Ohne den Stock, aber mit dem Becher, kehrt sie in den letzten Szene zurück, die dem Schachspiel gewidmet ist. Auch hier sitzen die beiden Spieler auf aufwendigen Hockern mit Kissen. Die Figur auf der rechten Seite bewegt einen Spielstein und ist die einzige, die eine Haube trägt. Fachleute haben bestätigt, dass es sich um eine sehr genaue Darstellung eines Schachspiels in einer mittelalterlichen Handschrift handelt, sowohl hinsichtlich der Darstellung des Schachbretts als auch hinsichtlich der Farbe der Figuren, die genau der Farbe der Felder entspricht. Ich kann das nicht bestätigen, weil ich habe nie gelernt, Schach zu spielen. Wahrscheinlich stand dem Buchmaler ein Handbuch zu diesem Spiel zur Verfügung. Ich verzichte bewusst auf die Figur auf Folie 39 einzugehen. Es handelt sich um eine nachgetragene, jüngere Federzeichnung einer Frau mit Blütenkranz im Haar, die nicht zum ursprünglichen Entwurf der Handschrift gehört. Und jetzt kommen wir nur zur Suche nach möglichen Vorlagen. Was hat den Miniaturmaler, der diese Szenen geschaffen hat, inspiriert? Hatte er eine Vorlage zur Verfügung? Es wurden noch keine direkten Vorlagen für die Ikonographie der Miniaturen gefunden. Höchstwahrscheinlich standen dem Buchmaler Musterbücher zur Verfügung, aus denen er Inspirationen sowohl für die Initialen als auch für die einzelnen Figuren oder ganze Szenen schöpfen konnte. Ein Beispiel wäre das sogenannte Rainer Musterbuch aus dem Jahr 1213 aus dem Kloster Rhein beim Graz, das aus 13 Blättern mit Darstellungen von Handarbeiten, Künsten, Tier- und Pflanzenfiguren, geometrischen Mustern und verzierte Initialen besteht. Hier sieht man beispielsweise 2 Seiten mit den Tieren. Die Existenz solcher Musterbücher spiegelt sich möglicherweise auch in der Wandmalereien wider, die sich davon inspirieren ließ und ihrerseits wiederum eine Inspirationsquelle für Buchmaler sein konnte. Und damit kommen wir zum Problem der Lokalisierung des Entstehungsortes der Handschrift. Es scheint mittlerweile allgemein anerkannt zu sein, dass die Handschrift aus dem Tirol stammt, weshalb die Vermutung geäußert wurde, dass sie im Augustinerkloster Neustift bei Brixen entstanden sei. In dieser Region, einer wichtigen Transitroute von Italien durch die Alpen nach Norden, treffen Kulturen und Sprachen aus dem Norden und Süden aufeinander, was zur Entstehung einer reichen und komplexen, eigenständigen Kultur geführt hat. Bis heute sind dort zahlreiche Burgen und Schlösser erhalten geblieben, in denen sich Zyklen weltlicher Malerei aus dem 13. bis zum 15. Jahrhundert erhalten haben, die in Italien und Nordeuropa einzigartig sind. Sie wurden von den Adelsfamilien, die dort lebten, in Auftrag gegeben. In den Inventaren ihrer Besitztümer und ihren Bibliotheken finden sich Ritterromane und deutsche Besetzungen von Epen, wie beispielsweise in der Bibliothek von Viktor von Thun, in der eine Geschichte von Alexander, eine trojanische Geschichte in deutscher Sprache und das Epos vom König von Antiochia aufbewahrt wurden. Zu diesen erhaltenen Freskenzyklen gehören diejenigen im Schloss Rodeneck bei Brixen, das der Familie Rodank, Ministerialen des Bischofs von Brixen, gehörte und das älteste Beispiel profane Malerei im deutschsprachigen Raum darstellt. Dargestellt sind Szenen, Dargestellt sind Szenen aus dem Gedicht Iwein von Chrétien de Troyes, in der deutschen Fassung Iwein von Hartmann von der Aue, Anfang des 13. Jahrhunderts. Die Fresken werden in die Jahre 1215-1220 datiert, kurz nach der Abfassung des Romans. In jüngerer Zeit wurden auch Geschichten des heiligen Martin gefunden. Beachten Sie hier rechts den schematischen Baum auf der linken Seite, der an denjenigen im Bild der Natur unserer Handschrift erinnert. Aus dieselben Maler gehen auch die Fresken in der Johanneskapelle im Domkreuz von Brixen zurück, die um 1215, 1220 datiert werden. Sie zeigen eine Reihe von Allegorien des Throns Salomos und des Throns der christlichen Weisheit. Frauen, die auf einem Thron dargestellt sind und Ähnlichkeiten mit unserer Fortuna aufweisen. In zahlreichen Kirchen und Kapellen, die über dieses Gebiet verstreut sind, finden Sie Fresken, die die Hirschjagd darstellen. Erinnern Sie nicht in der Art, wie Sie den Kopf drehen, an die im Bild der Natur? Und zuletzt möchte ich Ihnen die Fresken mit profanen Motiven im Schloss Arch zeigen. Im sogenannten Spielsaal befinden sich 18 Fresken mit höfischen Szenen, auf denen Damen und Ritter beim Würfeln, beim Backgammon und beim Schachspielen zu sehen sind. Obwohl wir uns bereits im 14. Jahrhundert befinden, zeugen sie von der Verbreitung dieser Art. Aber Sie hören nicht. Aber nicht. Ich weiß nicht, warum man das sagt. Zwischen Brixen, Bozen und Trient waren die Höfe der Fürstbischöfe und Bischöfe bedeutenden Zentren künstlerischer Aktivität und zählten schon sehr früh Dichter, Musiker und Maler zu ihren Mitgliedern, die oft aufgrund ihres Ruhmes von außerhalb berufen wurden und Neuerungen und neue Stile mitbrachten. Meiner Meinung nach gab es in einem solchen Umfeld, einem Kreuzungspunkt und Treffpunkt zweier Sprachen und Kulturen, mit einem weit verbreiteten Interesse an Epen, Literatur und Malerei mit profanen Themen, die ideale Voraussetzungen für die Sammlung, Niederschrift und Illustration eines solchen Textes. Es bleibt jedoch offen, ob die Entstehung dieser Handschrift in der Abtei der Augustiner Chorherren von Neustift zu suchen ist. Ich habe die letzte Seite verloren. Ach, nein, ich habe nicht die letzte Seite. Also, ich erinnere mich aber, was ich geschrieben habe. Ich habe geschaut bei den Handschriften von Neustift. Die sind jetzt katalogisiert. Ein Teil ist in Brixen, ein Teil ist in Innsbruck, ein Teil ist wieder in Neustift. Und es gibt nicht so alte Handschriften oder nicht so profane oder nichts vergleichbar. Ich habe hier ein paar Beispiele von Neustift, wo irgendwie ähnliche Initialen gibt, aber sie sind ein Typ von Initialen, der sehr verbreitet ist. Die einzige, es gibt dieses Fragment in Neustift, der publiziert ist in dieser Publikation aus 800 Jahre Augustiner Chorherrenschrift ohne Signatur. Dieses Fragment hat eine ähnliche Buchstabe mit dieser Rot und Blau, aber ist wirklich das Einzige, das ich gefunden habe. Das heißt, ich glaube nicht, dass diese Handschrift in Augustiner Chorherrenstift geschrieben worden ist, außer wir finden irgendwann mehr Material aus Neustift. Aber mit dem Material, das wir jetzt haben, von Neustift, sicher in Neustift geschrieben, kann man das nicht sagen. Oder ich wage nicht, das zu sagen. Danke, tut mir leid, dass ich...
Vielen Dank, Frau Bernasconi. Das gar nicht schlimm, wenn der Schluss ein improvisierter ist als Improviso. Das gab jetzt faszinierende Einblicke in diese, ich sag mal, Bilderwelt, Illuminationen dieser Handschrift. Die zeigt ein ähnliches Bild, eigentlich das, was Christelle gezeigt hat. Man merkt ein Ordnungsmuster, aber es ist nicht wirklich logisch von vorne bis hinten, sondern es gibt offenbar viele verschiedene Schichten, Überlappungen, die nicht ganz logisch sind. Wobei ich mich jetzt frage, dieser Bilderschmuck ist doch ein gewisser Aufwand. Das widerspricht so ein bisschen den Eindruck, den ich vom Schluss von Christelles Paper mitgenommen habe. Ja, es ist halt eine Sammlung und vielleicht für eine Schule und Exemplar und ein bisschen loosey. Das kriege ich nicht zusammen.
Es war, als ob sie etwas Schönes hätten machen wollen, aber sie hätten kein Muster und sie haben improvisiert. Deswegen. Oder als etwas Schönes geplant und dann langsam.
Ja, vielen Dank für den tollen Vortrag. Christelle hat viel über die Hände geredet. Können wir etwas dazu sagen für diese Bilder? Würden alle von der gleichen Person gemalt? Ja, nein, vielleicht?
Also, ich habe nicht so extra geschaut, aber ich denke schon. Die Bilder schon. Die Initialen nicht, die Bilder schon.
Ah, die Initialen, genau. Die Lombarden, die beim ersten und zweiten Schreiber oder Schreiberin.
Jetzt das Problem ist, dass man sollte jetzt dieses vergleichen mit der Liste der Hände von Christelle. Aber schon hier sieht man, dass den gleichen Typ, zum Beispiel die A von 28 recto und die A von 33 verso gleich sind. Aber das ist für mich auch ein Problem, weil normalerweise so einfache Buchstaben wurden vom Kopist gemacht.
Nicht etwas dazu sagen darf. Also für mich sind die Hände der Schrift total unabhängig von der Verzierung, von dem Buchschmuck. Und deswegen denke ich auch, dass diese besondere, simple Silhouette, Initiale etwas später sind. Nicht. Aber ja, die Frage ist immer, ob dieses Buch verschiedene Lagen hatte. Man hat parallel verschiedene Lagen vielleicht hergestellt. Und danach trotzdem hat man eine Abteilung, wie man oft gesagt hat, also Amateur, ja, und so weiter. Aber trotzdem einzelne Lagen und danach hat man alles zusammengebracht. Das hast du auch ein bisschen skizziert. Ja. Und ich glaube, das ist schon sicher etwas solches. Aber wirklich, die Initialen, die Lombarden man findet sie überall, alle Typen, wenn ich so sagen darf, finden sich überall in der Handschrift. Fast nur die mit Filigranen findet man nur am Anfang, wie du auch gesagt hast. Aber die anderen findet man überall. Das heißt, dass dieses Buchschmuck wirklich danach, nach der Kopie, es ist unabhängig von meiner neuen Nomenklatur von endlich. Das spielt keine Rolle.
Ja, also diese Handschrift hat keine Logik. Auch in diesem Bereich, wirklich. Auch, dass sie plötzlich grün benutzt, hat keine Logik.
Ich habe mich gefragt, vielleicht hast du die Antwort, ob das Grün zum Beispiel erscheint in der Nähe der Miniaturen, die auch Grün haben. Ob die Farbe dann vorhanden war und dass man sie ergänzt hat, oder vielleicht die Rubrikation auch nicht total fertig war, oder ich weiß nicht.
Ja. Oder er hat in dem Moment keine Blau, kein Rot zur Verfügung und hat ein Blau.
Auch eine Logik. Andere Fragen, Kommentare? Any language? Wenn dem nicht der Fall ist, das passt nämlich gut. Erstens nochmal herzlichen Dank an Frau Bernasconi. So sind wir nämlich in der Zeit. Um 18 Uhr beginnt nämlich das erste Konzert in der Leonhardskirche. Für die, die sich nicht auskennen, es sind im Grunde nur 5 Minuten, 10 Minuten, wenn man schlendert und vielleicht den Weg nicht gleich findet. Es ist, wenn man aus dem Innenhof der Schola herauskommt, if you leave the inner court of the Schola to the Leonhardstraße, turn left and then straight ahead you will pop directly into the church, and more or less, for this you need perhaps 2 or 3 minutes more, just follow me or other guys who know the way. 6 o'clock sharp, the concert, and I thank all speakers and all participants here for this afternoon, and we're looking forward to tomorrow morning, where we'll start at 9:15. Funny. 9:15, again, sharp. Thank you all.